Hey, what's up, everybody? If you appreciate the format and you appreciate what we're doing here, then make sure you contribute to the Cash App, make sure you contribute to the PayPal, make sure you donate to the Super Chat. It's only you and your contributions that keep this thing going. Thanks. Hey, what's up, everybody? If you appreciate the format and you appreciate what we're doing here, then make sure you contribute to the Cash App, make sure you contribute to the PayPal, make sure you donate to the Super Chat. It's only you and your contributions that keep this thing going. Thanks. Hey, you guys, this is Dennis Sperling, and I'm back again to continue our series. We are talking again today about slavery. We're talking about the transatlantic slave trade. We are talking about some very uncomfortable subjects. Now, the reason that the transatlantic slave trade is something that Black men should definitely talk about is because 80% of those Africans stolen from the motherland up until about, 1806, I believe it was, were Black men. And so for the most part, it was about 80% Black men, 20% Black women for about 320 something years. And then for about the last 50 years, up until 1865, when slavery ended, that's when they began to bring Black women over. It was a business. It was Black men doing the labor of white men and the rest of the world for no compensation. We as Black men have a great misunderstanding about the true nature of the American institution of slavery. Black American women take the position that they were the biggest victims under slavery because they were both used for forced labor and to satisfy appetites of their slave owners, their sexual appetites, that is. However, the facts are up until the late 1800s, Black men were at least 80% of the slave population in the United States. Black women were all but excluded from the transcontinental slave trade. It wasn't until 1808, after the international slave trade was banned, Black women began to be brought in numbers equal to Black men. And this is only because they were imported to the United States and used as breeders. Moreover, a large percentage of free Black women owned slaves. And despite the romanticization of it, these were not their relatives. They owned them outright and used them for the same reasons as their white counterparts. Furthermore, Black women were often liberated and emancipated by their slave owners for the fact that they gave birth to the multiple children, and those children were oftentimes the progeny of white slave owners themselves. Thereafter, those slave owners even bequeathed those newly freed Black women ownership of all of his former slaves. The only true victims of slavery were Black men and boys. We don't understand the true culprit, which is greed and capitalism, and that there was an involvement by everyone, every nation, irrespective of race, creed, religion, which also includes our own African brothers and sisters, and our African American brothers and sisters, many of them former slaves themselves. As to the question of reparations, the first issue is who are the proper parties, meaning who are the defendants that would be sued in this regard. And as an experienced trial lawyer, civil litigation attorney, I want to examine it. the conversations about liability and fault associated with our free Black American brothers and sisters who are also slave owners. So today we're going to have another uncomfortable conversation about slavery. Now, before we get going good, I want to warn you that some of this is information that many of you have never heard before. It's not something that's comfortable to talk about. This is not things that were taught to you in your schools. I know I was never taught anything like this, at all. And so, many of you may be offended by it, but I think that it's something that we have to address, because if we don't begin to address it, then we really can't ever get an answer. So what I'm going to do at this point is I'm going to start the video. We're going to start off with a gentleman named Dr. Claude Anderson. I know he had a brief career in politics under the Jimmy Carter administration, but he brings up some good facts. Many of those folks in the conscious community know this man, but let's listen to what he has first. We're going to establish a foundation. Fair use.
Now, what he has to say on the matter.
Back over 200 some years ago, because you see, the fork in the road, that was the biggest darn death hole for Black slaves in the country off of the Eastern Shore. See, when Virginia, South Carolina, and North Carolina went into the slave-producing industry after the Constitution outlawed slave importing after 1808 into this country, they had to have another way to create babies to get slaves. So they started bringing in Black women into the country then in mass numbers. Then most of the Blacks in the feminist movement don't even understand that. They think that slavery was about Black women. It was not about Black women. Slavery was about man to man, men to men.
Okay. So the first thing I want to hit on that, he basically told you that oftentimes African-American women or women in the Black feminist movement will say, we were slaves, we were victimized by the white man, and we were forced to do labor, and then also our sexual, we were unmasked, we were exploited sexually, so we had slavery for Black women, and they're only imagining. They're saying slavery for Black women was horrible, it was twice as bad. Who could imagine? And then forced to carry a baby for a white slave owner that sexually assaulted you. See, the problem with that theory is it falls apart when you actually begin to look into history, when you actually begin to do the numbers. Now, I didn't come up with those numbers. That's Dr. Claude Anderson's numbers, and he's going to point out where he got those numbers from. As an attorney, the only thing I do is bring the experts up, let them explain what happened, and then let you, the fact finders, or here the jury, which we the fact finder, you hear the public, to make an assessment for yourself. If you're only anywhere from 20% of the slaves brought to the United States, those are women. That's it. Over 320 years. They weren't even being brought in droves until, and even those women that were here, those were basically women that the white slave owners used for sexual favors. And so those women would often end up having children for that sexual as a master. They were literally sex slaves. They were literally there, and they would be rewarded for their progeny. They would be rewarded for having the master's babies. And so those of us who consider ourselves red pill, those of us who consider ourselves having an understanding of female nature, recognize, number one, that women have no racial loyalty. All of them, white, Black, brown, whatever. Very rarely will they be loyal to a race. Women follow power, they follow strength. So given the option of being following the man who runs the plantation, or a man who's a slave on the plantation, knowing that the one who is the owner who runs the plantation can make your life easier, who are you going to side with? Who are you going to willingly cooperate with? And I'm not saying that by any means being taken and forced to, from your land where you were born, your language, by no means is that a vacation. But what I'm saying is women are survivors. We all know that. And given the option, at some point they acquiesced. At some point after 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 of master and his kinfolks as babies, and they realize, you know what, this is a good option for me. I could end up owning these slaves. You have to understand that for the most part, you black brothers, you brothers didn't have those options. The sisters, the black women had that option. You didn't have that option. And that's why you have the vast majority of black slave owners being black women as opposed to black men. Now, I'm beginning to understand why the question of reparations is usually just something that we talk about theoretically, because between the African kings and countries that kidnapped their brothers and sisters and sent them to the United States, knowing what they would have to go through, doing it all for money, between the Africans that actively participated in it, and now the African Americans that also participated in it, I'm starting to see why the reparations question was never taken serious. The primary beneficiary of reparations would be those who suffered the most, and that would be black men. And so I see now why people don't really want to do it, why people don't really want to go through with it. Because again, the primary beneficiaries would be black men based on what we're seeing now. So let's continue forward and moving forward. Let's see what else Claude Anderson has to say.
It's about blacks against white men and black men and white men against black men. That's what slavery is about. 80% of all the slaves coming to the country were basically black men. Under the Constitution in 1789 says you got 25 years to cut out and no more bringing in slaves. And it's in the 3 states that pushed to get that 25-year postponement from 1789 up to 1808 was South Carolina, North Carolina, and Virginia. They said, give us a chance to get situated because we need these black slaves. And why they need black slaves? Because they said, because the wealth of these states and the wealth of these colonies, the wealth of this nation is in black slaves. That is the primary generator of wealth. Black slaves are a form of currency. It's like money. That's who generates the wealth in the country. A black slave was like a walk-in express card, a Visa card. A white man who owned a slave did not have to work. He could earn money just by renting that slave out and going earning it. And so South Carolina, North Carolina, and Virginia, they started bringing in black women in here so they can impregnate them and started getting babies free, where they were paying about $25 or $27 a piece, getting them off the coast of Africa. Then started selling for $800, $900 at about a 1,500% profit margin in the United States. They didn't have to do that any longer. They started using black women, impregnating them, and raising free black slaves. But once they raised those slaves, they then had to take them across the country. And the biggest death hole for receiving them was called a fork in the road. That was in New Orleans. New Orleans was a fork in the road. They made those blacks walk from Virginia, South Carolina, and North Carolina all the way barefooted, in chain, all the way to the fork in the road in the New Orleans area. And it's sort of ironic that with the whole enslavement process and the marches across America to the fork in the road, that the fork in the road has not changed. Why no older? Black folk are still marching, still going someplace, still in chains mentally, and still winding up producing wealth and income and enriching other people. Black folk have enriched every religion, every ethnic group, every culture. They've enriched in every nation. They've enriched everybody on the earth but themselves. They are the primary engineers of wealth. The wealth of this nation was built on the backs of black slaves and Indian land. And
all right, so you guys got that. Basically, what you get from that is that 80% of the slaves brought to the United States before 1808 were black men. And that's from Dr. Claude Anderson. You can look him up. He's a renowned scholar. He's an African-American history, African-American movement type person. I do know that he worked for the Jimmy Carter administration back in the 70s. So the next thing we want to talk about is we want to talk about black slave masters, okay? Because in the question of reparations, It's not just about the Africans, it's not just about the Europeans who purchased the Africans from Africa. It's not just about the African kings and the governments that succeeded those royal families that must pay reparations. But it's also about the slave owners who received wealth. And those slave owners were not all white. They weren't all white men, and they definitely weren't all white. There were many of them were black men and women. Now, interestingly enough, because of the favoritism that the slave master showed black women, because they were their sexual objects, they were, some of them were their baby mothers. Because of that, you know, these guys had a soft spot, like the simps that they are. They gave these women slaves. They freed them oftentimes after the end of slavery. So we're going to go ahead and bring that issue up, and we're going to talk about that. So I'm going to go into the next. I'm going to go into the next video, which is called. And you can. All these links are in all these links are here for everybody to choose to link up to. They're at the bottom in the description section. And so we're going to go ahead and proceed with this one. And we'll take. I'm going to fast forward here and there, but I want you guys to hear some of what's going on in here.
As we think back to history, a lot of the things that were taught to us in the school with regards to slavery has always been a focus on blacks being owned by white. What we don't talk about is the blacks who sold the blacks to the Europeans who actually brought our ancestry over to this country. What we don't talk about are the other peoples of the world who've actually been enslaved in history before. A lot of us know history where there was a group long ago who was actually enslaved for over 400 years. So today we're going to talk about free blacks who actually owned slaves. Now, during this period of time, in this country, there were actually 4 million blacks. And of that 4 million, about 250,000 of them were actually free.
Listen to that.
As we take the time to study who owned slaves,
about 250,000 black people were free. Out of 4 million, about 250,000 were free. So listen to this.
Relative to the size of the population in this country, be it black, white, or Native American, blacks own a larger percentage of slaves as it relates to the other races that were here. There's also evidence that blacks own white slaves. And then some free black people in this country bought slaves. And I'm not saying every black that were free actually owned slaves, but a large number did. Since 1654, continuing right through the Civil War, blacks owned slaves. Now, we can actually stop right there.
So before this country, before the United States was even founded, there were blacks who owned other black slaves. Okay, that's basically what they're saying. And it's not saying that all of the free blacks owned slaves, but for the most part, they saw it as a capitalistic endeavor. If you were free, you probably, you were trying to build a business or a company or something like that, or whatever, a plantation. You needed the labor. And so not only did they, there's some indication, and what he's talking about is that there was a law that came into place, I believe it was 17 something, and I'll come up with the case in a minute, that there was a black man who owned a slave, and the slave said, "Nah, I'm getting out of here." It turns out the owner was black and the slave was black. But one of the rulings said, well, blacks can own blacks, but blacks can't own whites, or what they refer to as Christians. That was like a code word. So up until that point, there is some evidence that that blacks had white folks as what they would call indentured servants, not quite slaves, but they had to work a debt off. So that's what he's referring to. But let's continue watching.
Just throw this in that the very first slave owner in this country was a black guy named Anthony Johnson. And if you don't believe me, look him up yourself. The very first slave owner in this country was a guy named Anthony Johnson. Now, as we review these numbers, it is too extensive of a list to include every black person that owned slaves. So for the sake of time and the sake of you having to listen to me share this information, I'm only going to include everybody that owned 10 or more slaves. A lot of times those who own less than 10 were actually owning family members, and there was a sign of benevolence so that they could keep the family intact. So I'll respect that. This is a compilation of various books, various study. I've had some folks tell me that most of these slave owners that we say were black don't count because they were Creole or mulattoes. And normally you find those people with those labels coming out of Louisiana, you know, the French purchase and things like that. And I myself, before my mother married and my stepdad, my last name was a French last name.
All right. So this gentleman is going to be reading off a set of documents. I have posted them on my Facebook page. Please, when this is over, go to my Facebook page and download those documents. They're in PDF form, not PDF. They're in JPEG form, so you can download them directly to your phone or whatever and then you can print them out so you can have them. This is what he's reading from right here. So let's continue. He's talking about black slave owners, and those are some of them.
So we're going to keep that in mind as well. So when folks tell me that we can't claim this as being black, they're totally off the mark, because these same folks are excited about our supposed first black president, who was also of mixed heritage. These same folks were excited about Tiger Woods being on top of the golf world, and Tiger Woods is of mixed heritage. Now, as a side note, when you want to educate yourself a little bit more, go look up Thomas Jefferson, Andrew Jackson, Abraham Lincoln, Warren Harding, and Calvin Coolidge, who all had black fathers. Check on Dwight Eisenhower's parents. His mother was black. And if you want to figure out who the very first president of our Continental Congress was, look up a guy named John Hanson, who was a Moor. And a Moor is a population of people from Northern Africa. So we cannot claim to have a black president while at the same time claiming that these slave owners were not black because of the Creole or mulatto label.
All right. Now, I'm going to stop it right there, but I want to point out some points. Basically saying a lot of people will say, oh, well, the black slave owners, they only owned their own family members to make it easier for them. But that's not acceptable, because that might have counted for those black slave owners who own less than 10 slaves, but it doesn't count for those black slave owners in America. When we talk about African Americans, you're talking about African American slave owners that own more than 10 slaves. This is all the only people he's talking about. So everybody after that owned multiple slaves, okay? Multiple other African brothers and sisters.
Now, in the case of those in Louisiana, there's a lot of those, as I mentioned. You know, we had the French purchase, Louisiana purchase from the French and all that. So that goes hand in hand. There's a lot of mixed ancestry. So we'll start off with John Carruthers Stanley, who was born a slave in Creighton County, North Carolina. He was the son of an Igbo mother, and Igbo is a tribe of people in southeastern Nigeria. They're still prevalent today. And her master, who was John Wright Stanley. He became an extraordinarily successful barber and speculator in real estate in New Bern. As Lawrence Swinninger points out in Black Property Owners in the South, by the early 1820s, Stanley owned 3 plantations and 163 slaves, and even hired 3 white overseers to manage his property.
So this black man had 3 plantations and owned over 163 slaves in South Carolina. This black man, his mother was an Igbo, his mother was straight up from Africa. See, we can't allow I guess our fear of exposing the truth, that we helped oppress ourselves, that we took advantage of the financial system that white folks set up to benefit them. We have to accept the fact that our own people owned us. Now, we're going to talk about this too, because some of y'all going to say stuff like, oh, well, he probably he probably was treating them better than the white man. He hired 3 white overseers. You understand what I'm saying? He hired 3 white overseers to keep them 3 plantations worth of slaves. 163. That's a huge plantation. There's only 100 families in the South that owned over 100 slaves in the first place. So let's keep watching.
Property. He fathered 6 children with a slave woman named Kitty, and he eventually freed them. Stanley actually lost his estate when a loan for $14,962 he had co-signed with his white half-brother, John, came due. After his brother's stroke, the loan was Stanley's sole responsibility and he was unable to pay it. And see, the image that we're looking at on the screen right now, Black Masters, a free family of color in the Old South, is actually a book written by Michael Johnson and James Rourke, and it's talking about William Ellison and his family. Now, at the death of William Ellison on the eve of the Civil War, he was wealthy than 9 out of 10 white people in South Carolina. He was born in 1790 as a slave on a plantation in the Fairfield district.
Now we're talking about a different black man now, okay? Now William Ellison, he was born in 1790 and he died in December 5th, 1861. He was a U.S. cotton gin maker and blacksmith in South Carolina and a former African-American slave who achieved considerable success as a slave owner before the American Civil War. He eventually became a major planter and one of the medium property owners and one of the wealthiest property owners in the state. According to the 1860 census, in which his surname was listed as Ellerson, he owned 63 black slaves, making him the largest of the 171 black slave owners in South Carolina. So there were 171 black slave owners in South Carolina. He held 40 slaves at his death and more than 1,000 acres of land. From 1830 to 1865, he and his sons were the only free blacks in Sumner County, South Carolina, to own slaves. The county was largely devoted to cotton plantations, and the majority of the plant population were slaves. Ellison and his sons were among the number of successful free people of color in the antebellum years, but Ellison particularly outstanding. His master has passed on a social capital by apprenticing him to learn a valuable artisan trade as a cotton gin maker, at which Ellison made success. He took a wife at age 21. After buying his own freedom when he was 26, a few years later, Ellison purchased his wife and children to protect them from sale as slaves. The 1820 Act made it more difficult for slaveholders to make personal manumission, but Ellison gained freedom for his sons and quasi-freedom for his surviving daughter during the American Civil War. Okay, so this man, all these people were not this man's, children, family members. These are people he owned outright that weren't relatives.
Of the state, far country from Charleston. In 1816, at the age of 26, he bought his own freedom and soon bought his wife and their child. In 1822, he opened his own cotton gin. Now, see, that's a whole nother point right there. If we took the time to understand real black history, we'll understand a lot of black folks actually owned business during a time that we were supposedly all enslaved. Mm-hmm. So black men were about business back then too. And Ellison became quite wealthy. By his death in 1860, he owned 900 acres of land and 63 slaves. Now, this is a kick in the bucket right here. Not one of his slaves was ever allowed to purchase his or her own freedom.
You hear that? So this black man who owned slaves in South Carolina, he didn't let not one slave go free, period. None of them went free at all. He kept them all. All right, so he wasn't one of them, oh yeah, I'm gonna let my knee. This was not benevolent. This was a business. He was in it for the money and in it for the greed, period. You see what I'm saying? So y'all have to accept that. So he, just like the rest of him, his family, and those people who benefited from slavery, they also should have to pay reparations. They must. You got to name them all. Let's continue.
Now we're going to move on over to Louisiana. By 1830, in Louisiana, several black people there owned a large number of slaves, including the following. In Point Coupé Parish alone, Sophie de Lunde owned 38 slaves. Lefroy de Queer owned 59 slaves. Antoine de Queer owned 70 slaves. And the de Queers are actually some of my wife's ancestry. Mm-hmm. And as I mentioned,
let me tell you something. I know people. I lived in Louisiana for a while, and I know members of the de Queer family. I've seen that name float around, and they are very proud of their heritage. They are very proud that they're successful Negroes and had money, and they are very proud of that. Okay, so many of them know. Many of these folks know that they're descended from black people who own slaves. I know a young lady who actually worked for me in my law office as my office manager several years back from Louisiana. And she would announce, yeah, I used to own slaves. She was very proud of that fact. Many of you know people who own slaves, who are black, who came from slave owning families. You haven't asked enough questions. And because this is just something that's unheard of, you don't really ask the right questions. Let me tell you something else. I went to visit my adopted family in North Carolina. And I found it very odd as I was looking through their family album that many of them were very fair-skinned. And I said, well, where's the black people at? You know, well, we mixed with white and Indian. I'm like, okay, I'm looking through the family photo. Everybody is light as that wall behind me back there. And I'm like, where are the black people at? And I'm sitting on this. How did these black people get all this land? Where did this come? Y'all been having this for hundreds of years? How did y'all get all this? And it dawned on me like, oh, they own slaves. They had a street name. They consider themselves a black family. And I understand now why my adopted grandfather, who was a very dark-skinned black man from North Louisiana, made my adopted grandmother sell that land, sell her portion to that land in North Carolina, and they moved to California to the Marine base where my adopted father and his brother and sister were raised. The black man didn't want to have anything to do with that. His wife, my adopted grandmother, being a very fair-skinned woman, I understand now. I understand now. It was just unspoken. It's like when you got a cousin that sell dope, but you don't really want nobody to know. This is kind of what we're looking at, but it happened. And a lot of these Black American people who brag about what their family had. My grandma owned land in Alabama. My granddaddy owned land in North Carolina, South Carolina. My people own land in Virginia. What they're really telling you is we own land, and if they own land, they more than likely had slaves, black slaves, working for them because they weren't allowed to own white slaves. So keep that in mind. They're very proud of this, so you shouldn't have any problem when extracting your reparations out of them in any forthcoming lawsuits.
This was never shared with her by anybody in her family. And down from the New Iberia Cave area of Louisiana, this is where they were from. Leandre Severin owned 60 slaves, and Victor Duperron owned 10. In St. John the Baptist Parish, Victor Deslandes owned 52 slaves, and in Plaquemine Brûlé, Martin Donato owned 75 slaves. In Bayou Tech, Martin Lenormand and his family in St. Martin Parish owned 89 slaves. In West Baton Rouge Parish, Barrett Pollen owned 69 slaves. The Ricard family owned 27. Phil's Honoré owned 30. Francis Gerard of Washita Parish owned 33. And C.C. McCarty in the upper suburb of New Orleans.
Listen to these names. Many of you guys know a famous Honoré. That was that general that came down after Hurricane Katrina hit. Remember that guy? He was an honoré. Here's another thing. Many of those prominent blacks after Reconstruction that end up going to Congress and whatnot, Many of them are wealthy slave owners themselves in the South. Many of these black slave owners have more money than the white slave owners. You see? Now, I'm not saying that the black slave owners outnumbered the white slave owners. What I'm saying is they existed. What I'm saying is we have Judases among us, and we have to accept that. We have to look at that. We have to examine that in any forthcoming lawsuit, because if you just try to make this a black and white thing, they're gonna say, well, what about the Negroes that sold the slaves to us in Africa? What about the Negroes that were our cohorts and participated? What about the Negroes that owned slaves here in the United States? They got streets and parks and cemeteries named after them and all that. What about them? Y'all not gonna sue them? Make this. You got white people who didn't even get to this country till after the 1920s when they got shipped over here from Ireland and Scotland, and you got black peoples right here that owned your people, owned our people, owned their own people, owned us, interbred with them, all that. So everybody's got to pay. Everybody's got to pay. Everybody owes you what they owe you, and they all got to pay.
Orleans owned 32 slaves. Now, the 13 members of the Montoya family, led by Nicholas Augustine Montoya, collectively owned 215 slaves up in Natchitoches, Louisiana. Which I mentioned, that's where my side of the family from.
You got to understand something, brothers. If you own 250 slaves, you were super rich. So you got a family of black people before the Civil War that owned 250 slaves. They were super rich. There was only 100 families in the South that owned more than 100 slaves. So if you got a family of black folks that own over 200 slaves, they are super rich. This is what was going on. Why is it that we were never taught this? I see now why that reparations question dies amongst actors, because when you start scratching below the surface, it becomes very uncomfortable, because people now have to start looking at their grandmas and their great grandmas and their great granddaddies in a different way. Great granddaddy owned slaves, but great granddaddy was black, yeah, but great granddaddy owned slaves. See, now you're going to have to look at, well, damn, we might be one of the defendants involved in this case, or whatever we recover might be diminished by the fact that we were part of the culprits ourselves. This is what you have to look at when you look at the question of reparations. This is it. This is all in here. Let's keep looking. Everybody needs to be held responsible, though. Nobody gets off. The whites, the blacks, the Africans, the African Americans. Everybody has to pay. Everybody has to pay this horrible debt.
It's from on my mother's side. T. Sandlin of Jefferson County owned 12 slaves, and J.B. Packard owned 11. The Duplessis family collectively owned 30 slaves. Joseph Curiel of Point Coupé owned 40 slaves. Sarah Hamrock of Natchitoches owned 12, as well as Florentine Corner, who owned 16. And Charles.
Listen to all these women. Listen to all these women who own slaves. See what would happen during that time period. A woman, white women included, the only property they could own outside of their husband was slaves. So the vast majority of the property that women own in general was held by them, their slaves. They couldn't own land, but they could own slaves. So these were their slaves. This was their property. So that's why you got a whole lot of women whose husbands and paramours and daddies bequeathed them slaves. So a lot of these women own slaves. Think about that.
Moliere owned 10 slaves. V. Rilliot owned 49 slaves in St. John's Baptist Parish. And C. Perrin and St. Dusan owned 38 slaves collectively. Laurent Malvo of Bellevue owned 18 slaves. In Bayou Mallet, Jean B. Guillory owned 18. And back over to Bayou Tech, Valerian Ossand owned 27 slaves. Jean Lasassier owned 19. Joseph Balky owned 18. Jean B. Moulion owned 52. And Jean Gallo owned 12. In St. Mary, Filippo Boutte owned 10. And back to the upper suburbs of New Orleans, Louise de Vivier owned 17 slaves. Sanique Grand Maison owned 13. Cantrell de Forge owned 11. Missy Kempran owned 10. Monique Volant owned 10. Pierre Rupon owned 13. Virginia Mangona owned 10. Dershell Rhodes owned 11. Genevieve Rigobert owned 16. Rose Lenoir owned 13. Desiree Athanase owned 11. Daniel Duperrier owned.
Again, listen to all these women. Listen to all these women who own slaves. All these black women. These are all black women that own slaves. And again, if you guys want this link to what he's reading, I put it in the chat room. Continue listening though. And I want to address one question. Our Alexis says, Dennis Sperling Unfiltered, don't forget the Native American tribes who owned slaves too. Not only did they own slaves, but they call them the 5 civilized tribes. They fought on the side of the Confederacy to keep their slaves. In other words, when the North was fighting the South and the Indians, the Indians sided with the Confederacy to keep their slaves. That's how serious they were about their slaves. They fought against the North.
10. Gabriel Mokalos owned 11. Louise Vavant owned 10. Eulalie Mandeville owned 13. M. Dupai owned 11. Constance Rivera owned 17. Caroline Miller owned 13. Pierre Saint Amand owned 17. Lord Piaro owned 13. Wid Duvalon owned 10. And Cecil Marcow owned 10. Now we move on to down in Iberville Parish, where Antoine Dubuclay and his wife Claire Pollard owned more than 70 slaves when they were married. According to Thomas Clarkin, by 1864, in the midst of the Civil War, they actually owned 100 slaves worth $94,700. Now, 1864, and their worth is $94,700. I haven't put the math figures to that, but it would be a substantial fee today. So it was very substantial back then. And if we go by the standard that money actually increases, well, doubles every 10 years, it's supposed to double every 10 years on everything except our salaries. That's a whole lot of money. And during Reconstruction, he became the state's first black treasurer, serving from 1868 to 1878. Now, Andrew Durnford was a sugar planter and a physician who owned the St. Rosalie Plantation, 33 miles south of New Orleans. And you say 33 miles of New Orleans, so you're probably looking at somewhere like Morgan City, Thibodeau, Homer, somewhere around in there. Or here at that.
$94,000 would be worth about $1,574,733. Basically, that black man who owned those 100 slaves, he was worth about $1.5 million. Okay, so that family that owned 260 slaves, they were worth about a little over maybe $3.5 million. All right, so you had millionaire slave owners, millionaire black slave owners in the South before the Civil War. Black people that own other black people. This is what you're dealing with.
The way, at least. In the late 1820s, David O. Whitten tells us he paid $7,000 for 7 male slaves, 5 females, and 2 children. He traveled all the way to Virginia in the 1830s and purchased 24 more. See, it was all about business.
Yeah.
You know, it wasn't about people. It was about business and economics. Now, I never said it was right. You know, don't make that mistake. I never said it was right. I don't believe enslaving anybody is right.
Yo,
but
let me tell you something. When they say stuff like, oh, they just did it out of, love for their family. They only bought their family. That's a damn lie. They did it because if they didn't do it, somebody else was going to do it. They did it because they had to make money to feed their families. They did it because everybody else was doing it. They did it because it was legal. They did not care about your black behind. They were blacker than you. Some of them blacker than you were. Some of them sleeping with the damn slaves themselves and then selling the children off. Our own black brothers and sisters were involved in this horrible system. And again, I'm just putting it in see, this is information that is not readily shared. We've talked about our African ancestors, our African kings and queens that we venerate so much, who worked along with the Europeans, who waited on the coast for our African, the agents to come and bring the black men and women to them. All right. So we know that our African brothers and sisters were involved in it. And then we also know that our own African-American brothers and sisters here in the United States held into slavery. If we want reparations, everybody has got to pay for this harm. Yes, the white man has to pay too, but we proved that case. We know that. We know that he's culpable. But what about these black slave owners who weren't any better than the white slave owners? They have to pay too. Everybody has to pay.
It was a system of economics. Eventually, Durnford would own 77 slaves. When a fellow Creole slave owner liberated 85 of his slaves and shipped them off to Liberia, Durnford commented that he couldn't do that because self-interest is too strongly rooted in the bosom of all that breathes the American atmosphere. And see, that's an old nother.
You heard that? Now, you have one black man, a mulatto man, who freed all his slaves, and he sent them to Liberia. Liberia is a country in Africa. Send them back over there to Africa. Y'all free now. Y'all go home. I'm sending y'all. He shipped them all back to Africa. And another black slave owner said, "Oh, hell no. I ain't sending mine. I got to get my money. I'm not doing that." And then so this dude named Jeb Star said, "Look, this is the problem that I have." Jeb Star saying, "How they gonna pay? They're all dead." I mean, that's the same silly response that we get when we talk about white folks who own slaves. White folks say the same thing. Why am I responsible for what my ancestors did? They're all dead now. I don't own any slaves. But you got the benefits of it. Many of these black people who own this land, many of these black people who were able to go to these colleges, you know, they had that. Where do you think some of these black colleges came from? We say, oh, they were started by slave owners. Many of those slave owners were black. Many of those slave owners who donated the land were black. Who contributed to forming these colleges, they were black. And they would send their children to these colleges. Everybody always says stuff like, well, Howard University was started by former slave owners or by former congressmen who were sleeping with those women in Washington. No, it was also started by black people who had money, who had land, who had slaves, and wanted their children to go to college. So they sent them up there to Howard and some of these other elite black colleges, Hampton, Howard, all these other places. Where you think the money came from? You got millions of black people roaming around the South with nothing, no shoes on, and then all of a sudden, you got a certain class of black people that become governor, and they are during Reconstruction. They're governors, they're mayors, they are congressmen. Where did they get their education from if all of us just got free and it was illegal for us to read books? Where did all these black congressmen come from? Many of them were slave owners from the South. That's what I'm telling you. They just benefited from we free now. Okay, yeah, we were slave owners, but we still black, so we're just gonna benefit from that too. They won. They were able to hide under their blackness and pretend as though they were victims when in actuality they were victimizers. That's what these black slave owners did. Let's keep on reading. Take this medicine. And I know it's uncomfortable. It's supposed to be uncomfortable for you. But everybody needs to pay. In the first way, and the reason we're learning about this so you can go ahead and set it in your mind that they need to pay.
Other thing, we complain about all the ills of America, but we American when it's to our benefit. The wealthiest black person in Charleston, South Carolina in 1860 was Maria Weston, who owned 14 slaves and property valued at more than $40,000 at a time when the average white man earned about $100 a year. That's amazing, isn't it? Now, even though she was the wealthiest, she didn't own the largest amount of slaves. The city's largest slaveholders were a guy named Justice Angel and Mistress L. Horry. Both of them owned 84 slaves each. In Savannah, Georgia, between 1823 and 1828, according to Betty Wood's Gender, Race, and Rank in a Revolutionary Age, Hannah Leon owned 9 slaves, while the largest slave owner in 1860 was Cyprian Ricard, who had a sugarcane plantation in Louisiana and owned 152 slaves with her son Pierre, many more than the 35 she owned in 1830. So we talk about 1860 to from 1830 to 1860. In 1830 she had 35. In 1860 she had 152. So she wasn't looking to free anybody, her and her son.
Listen to that.
According to
these slave owners, they fought against freeing slaves. They didn't want to free their slaves. They didn't want to free their black brothers and sisters. They didn't want to free anybody. And they wanted all mulattoes. You see what I'm saying? They came in all different colors. You see what I'm saying? All of them daddies and whatnot wasn't black. They were just outright free black people. We gonna own some slaves, period. And we're gonna use this system just like they using the system.
To the economic historian Stanley Ingerman, in Charleston, South Carolina, about 42% of free blacks owned slaves in 1850.
Did
and about 64.
42% of in Charleston, South Carolina, 42% of free black people own slaves. 42%, that's damn near half. Damn near half of the free black people own slaves. Now I want you to hear something else that's very important. I'm gonna run that back a little bit because I want you to hear this in context. All right.
Carolina, about 42% of free blacks owned slaves in 1850. And about 64% of these slaveholders were women.
Did you hear that? In Charleston, South Carolina, basically 42%, a little under half, of the free black people owned slaves. And did you hear how many of them were women? Let's run that back. I want you to hear that. That's important. So you can know that these lovely ladies benefited from slavery. They benefited.
Free blacks owned slaves in 1850. And about 64% of these slaveholders were women.
64% of those slaveholders, of the 42% of free blacks that owned slaves, 64% of them were black women. 64% of them were black women. 42% of the free black people owned slaves, and 64% of that group were black women. And see, I think it's hard for you brothers to accept the fact that our lovely ladies have always received the benefit of a privileged position here in the United States because they're women. They're not considered a threat. They're able to render sexual favors. They play the game. And they reap the benefits of it. So why do they have even an incentive to? The vast majority of the slaves were men anyway. Black men specifically, at least up until 1808. This is what you have to understand. Do we understand female nature? Do we understand human nature? People are going to do what's in their own best interest, irrespective of color. And you know, ladies said, we're the most educated group. You've always been a privileged class. Of course you're going to be the most educated. You're the most educated group now. You have been. The vast majority of the wealth amongst the free blacks were held by women because they own the majority of the slaves. And that's how it went. Daddy died, master died, left his woman some slaves, left his daughter some slaves. That's her wealth. And see, a lot of you black men are hard-headed. You know, you don't believe fat meat is greasy. You looking at it in your face, it's like, damn, I feel like these sisters is working for the other side. You know, you'll talk about one Harriet Tubman, but you won't mention these hundreds and hundreds of black women that own slaves. Think about that. You've been brainwashed. And that's because you come from that mother goddess simp chip that's been implanted in your head. You still trying to make an excuse for why these black women own slaves. Oh, they was just doing it out of, you know, love for their family. Not with 163 of them. I'm just saying, fellas, I mean, these are the facts. And there was black men that owned slaves too. And you know, not all of them was mulatto. They were just straight up brothers. But let's keep on listening. Now think about it. If you was that goddamn white, you would just, light skin, you would just pass for white. These was black folks owning other black folks. Keep on listening.
Greed, Greed, in other words, was gender blind.
Greed was gender blind. That's
Carter G. Woodson also tells us that some of the husbands who purchased their spouses were not anxious to liberate their wives immediately.
Now, here's the thing. Some of us say stuff like, oh, husbands just purchasing their wives. Okay. And that, okay, we get that. But there's also cases where these same black husbands who purchased their wives sold their wives back into slavery when they got tired of them. Go ahead and keep listening. It was a horrible situation. It was power and greed and human nature all up in this.
Said that an advisor would put them on probation for a few years. And if they did not find them satisfactory, they would sell their wives as other slaveholders disposed of Negroes. He then relates the example of a black man, a shoemaker in Charleston, South Carolina, who purchased his wife for $700. But on finding her hard to please, he sold her a few months thereafter for $750, gaining.
So this man purchased his wife out of slavery for $700. And then she was so difficult, even though he's not only your husband, but your slave, she found it so difficult to adhere to what her black husband had to say. Zero respect for him, right? He said, well, I'm gonna sell your butt. And he sold her into slavery for $7 and made a $50 profit. And there's instances where wives did the same thing. Black wives did the same things to their husband. So let's keep listening.
$50 by the transaction. Now, from this point forward, I'm just gonna go ahead and mention a city or county and a state and the individual's name and how many slaves they actually owned. So in Clark County, Alabama, we have a guy named P.T. Harris who owned 24 slaves and David Monack who owned 27. In Mobile County, Alabama, James Seymour owned 10 slaves and Louisa Chastain owned 14. In the city of Mobile, Alabama, Bernardaz Rosieste owned 14 and Madame Beauchamp owned 16.
And this is Mobile, Alabama. Now we're in Alabama, not just Louisiana, wasn't just South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia. It was all over the South. Okay, it was all over the South.
In Escambia County, Florida, Euphron Kennard owned 12.
Now, Escambia County, you guys know Pensacola. Y'all, many of you guys know what Pensacola. That's Pensacola. That's where Emmett Smith is from. It's that I-10. You ride I-10 all the way down. You headed from Louisiana or Texas over to Pensacola. This Escambia County is what you pass through. So it's everywhere.
In St. Johns County, Florida, Gabriel Paul owned 39 slaves. In Greene County, Georgia, Betsy Perry owned 25 slaves. In Anne Arundel County, Maryland, Richard Harwood owned 39 slaves. M. Meade owned 17.
All the way up in Maryland. So this wasn't just a Southern thing. It was black folks owning slaves all across, all across the United States. So it wasn't just a Southern thing. Keep that in mind. Maryland, Bmore, up there, big slave state, breeding state, as a matter of fact.
Richard Chase owned 15. Henry Menedier owned 17. Phillips Leitner owned 11. In Second Collection District of Maryland, Pompey Preston owned 11. And in Calvert County, Maryland, Sarah Skinner owned 13. In Allen's Fresh District, Maryland, John Hungerford owned 39. In Kent County, Maryland, Lucy Boyer owned 10 and John Constable owned 13. In Adams.
Again, this is Maryland. This is the North. You had black people own slaves in the North. So all them free blacks that was, up in the North. We lived in the North. We was free. They probably owned slaves too. There's a good chance. I'm going to say there's about a 50-50 chance that any of your relatives who are from the North and y'all lived in the North, you can trace your history back to the North. Our people were free. They probably owned slaves. Your black granddaddy Your black great-great-grandma, she probably was a slave owner, because if she was free, work needed to get done. She just cheap buy a slave, you know?
County, Mississippi, George Wynn owned 16. In Hancock County, Mississippi, William Perkins owned 17. In Craven County, North Carolina, well, I already mentioned that. We're back to Stanley, but this is actually James Stanley, who had to be a relative, but he owned 10 slaves. In the town of New Bern, North Carolina, Donna Mumford owned 10. In Bladen County, North Carolina, Gooden Bowen owned 44 slaves. In Martin County, North Carolina, John Cricklund owned 24 slaves. In Nash County, North Carolina, Humphrey Rebel owned 14 slaves. In the town of Fayetteville, North Carolina, Charles Mallet owned 36 slaves. In New Hanover County, North Carolina, John Walker owned 44 slaves.
Right.
In Beaufort County, South Carolina, Alexander Brown owned 15 slaves. In Christchurch, South Carolina, owned 41. James Ann Wilson, Thomas Strobel, Cuffy Al, Carolina, where Charles Tennant owned 38 slaves, and Henry Holmes and John Bell each owned 12. In St. Bartholomew's Parish, South Carolina.
At this point, you get the point. Now the gentleman is just reading off all the different black folks that own slaves. So this is not a fluke, okay? This is not something that's just in one state. This is not a one-off. This was a part of the. This is a system. This was the system of slavery. Okay. Now I want you guys to pay attention to this right here. Let's keep on listening. And I know this is an uncomfortable conversation. It's supposed to be. We're talking about in the context of reparations. We got to make sure we understand who the culprits are, who are the people that are responsible. And along with those white slave owners, you also have to talk about the black slave owners, and you have to talk about the Africans. And some of you would say, well, you know, it's enough. It's enough of them that they need to pay up, and some of them were rich. Some of them were the richest slave owners in the county. This might go down to a county by county lawsuit situation. You figure out which slave which slave owner in your county it might be, you know, especially in the Carolinas over there. Looked like it was rampant over there. So we're gonna go to another one. We're gonna talk about. I want to talk about this. This is a little bit about slavery itself. So give me a second. I'm gonna pull this up, and yeah, we need to accept reality. We need to stop living in. I see now why the conversation on slavery dies, because this would affect too many well-to-do and snooty and rich black folks. This is something that they definitely wouldn't want to deal with, and this is definitely drive some wedges between Africans and those who consider themselves Pan-Africans. They don't want to talk about this.
Was that the demand for slaves during the transatlantic slave trade was fueled by the...
That's not why I'm here, okay? I'm not here to make friends. I'm here to get justice for my black brothers, specifically, and anybody else who was enslaved here in the United States. Let's continue.
Availability of a supply chain which involved African rulers and tradesmen who made a fortune out of selling people. Between 1525 and 1866, 12.5 million Africans were shipped to North America, the Caribbean, and South America, according to the Transatlantic Slave Trade Database. Only about 10.7 million survived the dreadful journey under bondage and slave ships. The slave trade contributed to the expansion of the most powerful West African kingdoms such as Mali and Ghana, as the business became one of the main sources of foreign exchange for many years. Britain banned the slave trade.
So basically, we went over this, but this is basically talking about how that the Mali Empire, these people, these countries, they became rich from slave trade, from stealing black people and selling them to Europeans on the coast. They became rich doing that. Okay, so we talked about that. We're not going to backtrack over it, but just as a reminder, now I want you to hear some numbers. They already said about 12 million. That all the experts can agree. Some say more, some say less, but about 12 million blacks Africans were captured in Africa and brought to the U.S. And about 1.5 million died. But I want you to hear some more numbers.
In 1807, and the United States later abolished it in 1865. Brazil was the last to ban it in the Caribbean in 1888, marking the end of the barbarism inflicted on men, women, and children of color and their descendants. There were recorded protests by West African chiefs and traders after the abolition of slave trade due to the loss of revenue. In West Africa, the slave traders were known as cabochers, and they...
You hear that? They basically saying they protested after they end the chiefs and kings and what protested after the slavery, and they was mad. You see, they wanted to keep selling and shipping slaves off to the New World. They were getting rich. They had been doing it for over 300 some years. It was part of their culture at that point. They were getting rich, destroying lives. And you can't tell me they didn't know what happened or what was going on. So let's continue.
They lived on the coast. They were usually appointed by the African rulers to deal directly with the European slave merchants. Here are some notorious chiefs and cabochers who were actively involved in selling their own. 1. William Ansa Sesaraku, 1736 to 1770. He was a prominent 18th century Ghanaian.
We talked about this one already, so let's. I want to go on and talk about Philip Burnham. This gentleman, let me see.
Most profound effect. He was a graduate student.
I want to talk about some other slave owners here. We heard a little bit about him.
Fat puppy here, and boy, do I have a story for you. This is a family plot. Mm-hmm. Normally, I do churches and cemeteries involved. No church on this one. This is just a family plot. But the story is unbelievable, almost. So the subject of this story is a guy named Mr. William Ellison. He's actually in the back corner over there. You would think him being the rich guy that he ended up being, he'd have the biggest tombstone. He don't. I think you can't see it. But I think one of his sons actually has the biggest tombstone. So this is going to be an interesting story. Hang on to your hats because you're going to need it. Don't forget, if you like this video, put the thumbs up, subscribe.
Yeah, let's skip ahead a little bit. All right.
It's the stone of William April Ellison. Who is William April Ellison? Good question. He was a slave. He was born in slavery. However, he was given a chance to do good and to buy his freedom. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about his story. So he was born in 1790. Now I'm reading. That's why my attention is down here. Mm-hmm. He was born in 1790. His owner was William Ellison. As a matter of fact, later on when he was freed, he took his owner's name and called himself William Ellison Jr. He was apprenticed in 1802 at 12 years old and stayed an apprentice until 1816 as a 26-year-old. He spent 14 years as an apprentice learning the cotton gin. He learned how to be a blacksmith, a machinist, and a carpenter. And he was a master cotton gin maker. Now, usually what happened whenever an owner taught his slave a trade, something you make money with, basically the slave made the money but gave it to the owner. Had no choice. It was the laws at that time. But that's not what happened with this one. Because he was an apprentice so long, he did so much of his own work as a master gin maker, he was allowed to keep his money. That was very good of the people that apprenticed him and his owner. So anyway, he learned how to read, write, do math, which all was frowned upon for slaves at that time. They didn't want them being educated. They might get ideas about being free. And he learned, as I said earlier, how to be a blacksmith, a machinist, and a carpenter. So he brought his freedom. Seems like it was around 1818, I think, that he bought his own freedom. And you could just go to the master and say, hey, I want to be free. Let me buy myself. Here's the money. You had to go before a judge. I mean, the laws were pretty screwed up back then on how to become a free man if you were a slave. And then later on, he bought his wife, And if I remember correctly, 2 of his children, because they were also born into slavery, the master didn't have to sell them. So it seems like I'm putting the master in a good light here for a reason. It's because I am. Because of him, the master, the slave, was able to do well. But it still was, don't get me wrong, Mr. Ellison, April Ellison, as he was known, he was born by the name April because back then, from what I read, you were called by the name you were born in. So he was born in April. But anyway, obviously he had to work hard. He had to learn. He made his money. This was him. He made his money, okay? And he got to keep it. So thing with Mr. Ellison was he was a slave owner. That's right. He bought his freedom and then became a slave owner himself. In 1860, according to the census.
So check this out. So when we say our brothers and sisters who had us in bondage, they were nicer. That's a damn lie. They weren't. This man learned how to be a slave owner as an apprentice from 1802 to 1814. And then by 1860, look how many slaves this man had accumulated. And this is William Ellison. We spoke about him earlier. This is a black man.
He had where did I see it at? He had around 100 slaves.
So that's about $1 million.
I don't have it written down here. I thought I did.
A little over $1 million.
He had around 100 slaves. I think it's more like 89, 90, 91, something like that. Now, in 1860, South Carolina had 171 slave owners, black slave owners, which is
South Carolina had 171 black slave owners in 1860. This is at the dawn of the Civil War. The Civil War started and ended in 1865. 100 and how many? Did you hear that? This is how many of our own black people owned slaves. Listen to this, okay? Listen to this. See, this makes your theories uncomfortable, family.
The South Carolina had 171 slave.
Do you hear you hear that? 171 slave owners in South Carolina alone were black men and women. 171 slave owners. This is not a clean, cookie cutter, easily ascertainable concept, this American slavery system. Our own people owned us. People who were former slaves, who knew the atrocities of slavery, owned us. People who were slaves, escaped slavery, left the old world, left the new world, went back to Africa, still became slave owners. 171 black people or black families in South Carolina alone owned slaves. Other black people. Everybody's got to pay. All of y'all, everybody, you got relatives that own land back then that had slaves, they got to pay too. Reparations is everybody has to pay. Justice has no color. Everybody has to pay.
Owners, black slave owners, which is a shock to me. I knew that some blacks owned slaves. I just didn't realize there's that many, especially in South.
White folks didn't even know. White folks, see, they have a skewed history of slavery. They go, yeah, we owned your people. Hell, we owned ourselves. We captured ourselves and sold ourselves to the United States. White people don't even know that. Black people love to say white people know our history better than they. No, they don't. They just as ignorant as you are. But the cold part about it is nobody is hiding. Your history is right here. You just don't bother to look. You rather just accept the story that's being told to you. Now, looking at it like this, from a legal perspective, who would I sue? Theoretically, under a lawsuit for reparations, we haven't even got to the causes of actions yet. Probably somewhere lying unjust enrichment or something like that. In a civil action, we got to figure out who to sue. And we must definitely sue all the slave owners in the different states, which includes who? The black slave owners, which the majority of which were women, unfortunately. So let's keep listening. Black women at that. Let's keep listening.
South Carolina. This is deep South. Come on, you know how that goes. So, and he was Mr. Ellison was the biggest slave owner out of.
So, one thing I just want you to point out, folks. Now, we like to look at slavery and we like to say, oh, yeah, they treated all of us bad. We were not all equal. Black folks, you had rich slave owners and their families, and you had the slaves out there working in the fields and doing the housework and being the servants. It was different even then. It's not like you had paved streets everywhere and the police, why you couldn't call 911. Okay, this is what we're dealing with here. You basically had your own fiefdom, your own kingdom. And some of these black men, slave owners, and black women slave owners, they ruled these other black people like they were chattel, like they were peasants, and they had their own fiefdoms. They were cruel. They were as cruel as the white slave owners. You don't get to have 3 plantations and 163 slaves and be nice about it. So stop giving these horrible people the benefit of the doubt.
The black folks. And he had a 900-acre cotton farm. It's all woods now, but one time this was his farm. This plot was his land. Over there, just a little bit through the woods, was his house, which still stands. The house was actually built many years before he bought it, and it's now been soaked up, or had been soaked up into the Burl Plantation, which I talked about in one of the other videos, the one on Church of the Holy Cross, and they have it now. So anyway, surprisingly, well, maybe not surprisingly, he supported the Confederacy. He gave large donations. He wanted to join the fight, as did.
Did you hear that? This is a black man, slave owner, supporting the Confederacy. He did not care about your freedom. These are the same black people that after the war was over, they were the ones that end up becoming the governors of these different states and becoming the mayors of these different black, you know, we always talk about how well black folks did during Reconstruction and all that. And we had black folks in Congress. Many of those men were Southern slave owners. That's what they were. They were Southern slave owners. Many of these colleges that we have, black colleges included, that were formed and founded in the South, were financed by black slave owners and the money that they acquired. Some of your most horrible and atrocious policies and treatment came about from our own people treating us like that, as slave owners. They saw it as a business. They saw it as a business. Your body was just a business to them. You were just another commodity, like the hogs and the pigs and the mules on the farm. It should be painful to look at this because most of you guys have been lied to. Make sure y'all get the shares up when you. So we want as many people to see this as they can. And this is not me talking. This is these people who've done this research. This man is at the man's funeral. You don't think he exists? He is at the man's cemetery on his land that he used to own. The black slave owner William Ellison.
His sons wanted to join the fight, but they wouldn't let them because they were black. But they certainly were allowed to support, especially with money and horses.
Let me tell you something crazy. So Frederick Douglass was trying to convince Lincoln to let blacks join the Northern Army. It wasn't until the Confederate Army allowed, basically a platoon, a coalition, a regiment of black Confederate soldiers join the army. That Frederick would say, well, look, the Confederates got blacks fighting on their side, because remember, before that, the North was losing the battle. It wasn't until they let the black men in the North join the army that they began to win. But the black Confederates had the Confederate side, the South had black men fighting on their side. Many of these people were sons of slave owners. Many of these people were slave owners themselves fighting against the North. They didn't want them Negroes to be free. That was messing with their money. So when we see these black Confederate slave, these people say, I'm a son of the Confederate, I'm a black dude from the son of the Confederate. I know when I see him, well, you know, his people must have owned slaves. His people must have owned slaves. It was very common. It was very common for black people to own slaves. You had 171 black slave owners in North Carolina alone, or South Carolina alone. That's very common. When you got in cities like Charleston, 42% of the free black people. So out of every 100 people who you see walking around, black people who are free, 42 of them own slaves. That's very common. That's damn near half. It was very common for black people to own other black people, especially in places like South Carolina. Let's keep on listening.
And I know that says that he supported the Confederacy with substantial donations.
He paid.
Another thing is he was a member of the Church of the Holy Cross, the one I've already done a video on. He was a member in good standing. That meant he come in with the white folks. He had his own seat that he bought. That's where they did it back then to raise money.
You hear that? See, that's another thing I want you guys to understand. This was not all clean. White folks coming this side, black folks coming this side. It depended on how much money you had. That's the other point that I wanted to drive home. These white folks knew if they're rich, they would much rather be around other rich white folks than some poor, dirt poor peasant, as they call them, peckerwood, that that didn't have anything. They knew each other. Yeah, right. Yeah, but that's Mr. William Ellison. Let him in. Let him in. Bring him on up in here. Of course, he gets to sit in the front of the church. We're gonna let him speak. Yeah, he black, but he different. You know, he's the biggest slave owner in the damn county. And see, my man Vince M., good old sellout was he. Can we even call him a sellout, brother? Can we even do it? I mean, it was big business back then. I mean, they were just greedy. It was the American way. You see what I'm saying? This is what they did. And so I don't have any mercy about filing suit against them or their family or their estates or whatever they own. You know, just to them, it wasn't personal, it was business. So it shouldn't be personal to us. It should be business when we decide to get those of us who didn't have family members that own slaves. Those of us should definitely file suit and be compensated against those. And it's not personal, it's business. Same way they felt. Let's continue listening.
You would buy a seat, and there were some of them you could actually, as your property, will it to the next generation. He's not buried there. He's buried here. I'm doing a lot of because I'm trying to fill in here. So this is an amazing story. It's a man who was determined to work hard, who had a plan apparently, whose master and apprentice, person who apprenticed him, went along.
Look how the little fella, the little white dude is uncomfortable even talking about it. Because he had a theory that, all of our people owned all of your people. Come to find out, your people owned your own people. You see what I'm saying? Isn't that something? This little white man, well, I guess he worked. He doesn't even know how to explain this. You see, they don't even know our history like that. But pure up greed.
With the plan, and the only negative out of this, other than a former slave owning slaves, was that around here, Mr. Ellison is known about.
Mm-hmm.
And he is rumored to be one of the meanest slave owners in this area.
And listen to it. You know how we always say our black slave owners were more humanitarian than the white slave owners? Some of the meanest slave owners were blacks, men and women. So here's a story about how mean he is. Let's listen to how mean this black William Ellison former slave himself, how mean he was to his slaves.
Now, the stereotypical Southern slave owner as a mean master is it's a little stretched from what I've read of personal readings of people who own slaves who talk about the struggle with their conscience and how they try to treat them good. But I read one account of a guy, in fact, he was the guy that owned the Burroughs plantation, who at one point he said it's Christmas time. The little black kids, little slave kids, they're all around the windows looking in, look at Christmas decorations. You know, I run them off, act like I'm mad, but actually I think it's kind of cute. Those are not his words, those are my words. And then he wrote about July 4th, Independence Day. We have a big cookout. Slaves get the day off, they're invited to eat, family eat, neighbors eat, everybody eats, it's a good time. But then that same gentleman also wrote, I can hear him screaming now. When you have to hold down a people that should be free, as every person should be, by force, it is a terrible thing. And I'm having to do that as I am having one of my slaves whipped for not being the slave that he is supposed to be. Now that sounds terrible. I read that and I cringed. It was just, slave owners, it was a mixed bag of, sure, some were terrible. But anyway, I'm not here to defend slave owners. I've mentioned that in a video before. It's just I've studied the history of this and trying to figure out why in the world would they do that. And so that's basically where I'm at with that. Mr. Ellison, kudos to you, sir, for buying your freedom. Sorry about the rumors about you being a bad guy. Don't know if it's true or not. And what happened? So in my mind, I wondered, what happened when he died? Why is the family, nobody know anything about him anymore? So I did a little bit of reading on that. And basically, they just sold the land. I thought maybe it was taken from them by Jim Crow laws or something, because those were terrible. But they just sold the land and just kind of disappeared into oblivion, I guess.
They just sold the land and disappeared. They knew they was wrong. You're not going to be, think about it. Slavery is ended. And now you are one of those black people whose family got rich or lived well during the whole system of slavery. Of course you're going to slave that land. Of course you're going to sell that land. You don't want to hold on to that. All you black folks wondering why these black folks sold their land, why these farmers, they didn't want to have parts of that. They had to get away from that. That's why they got away from that. They just sold their land and they slid away. They trying to forget what their black granddaddy did. And in a mix with most of you guys who were slaves and played the same victim role, but still had the benefit that from the hundreds of thousands of dollars that they had acquired during slavery. They just sold it all. So they need to pay too.
I don't know. But that's his marker. And by the way, his house is still standing. It's right over there. I'm going to try to get a little video of it. I'm not sure that I can. It's kind of far back. It might not be a good video. But his house still stands.
And that's the house that he lived in. Look how well he was living during slavery. This black man, 2 chimneys, a couple of houses, huge. You see what I'm saying? So all of those black folks who had family members who were slave owners, and the information is not him. You can look up William Ellison Jr. in Wikipedia. He has his own Wikipedia page. Okay, so this is not something.
Property deprived of personal rights has occurred in many forms throughout the world, but one institution stands out for both its global scale and its lasting legacy.
Get the likes up.
The Atlantic slave trade, occurring from the late 15th to the mid-19th century and spanning 3 continents, forcibly brought more than 10 million Africans to the Americas. The impact it would leave affected not only these slaves and their descendants, but the economies and histories for the Americas. About 20% of them would never see land again. Most captains of the day were tight packers.
I want y'all to listen to this. Listen to this, folks.
chance to buy one's freedom. Others were more like European serfs. In some societies, slaves could be part of a master's family, own land, and even rise to positions of power. But when white captains came offering manufactured goods, weapons, and rum for slaves, African kings and merchants had little reason to hesitate. They viewed the people they sold not as fellow Africans, but criminals, debtors, or prisoners of war from rival tribes. By selling them, kings enriched their own realm.
This is the clean version of it. What we realized, what happened after yesterday, we realized that at some point they just began to manufacture wars just so they can have a reason to make, to capture people, to sell them into slavery. They ran out of wars, so they began to manufacture wars, got guns from the Europeans, went out there, slaughtered and massacred other tribesmen just so they can have a reason to do it, okay? So let's keep that in mind. All right, this young man, whoever's doing this, is giving us the clean version of it. But we know it got dirty after a couple of 300-400 years of it, almost 400 years of it.
And strengthened them against neighboring enemies. African kingdoms prospered from the slave trade, but meeting the Europeans' massive demand created intense competition. Slavery replaced other criminal sentences, and capturing slaves became a motivation for war rather than its result. To defend themselves from slave raids, neighboring kingdoms needed European firearms.
It became the motive. I want y'all, capturing slaves became the motivation for war. In other words, greed is the motivation, because we're going to start a war. Greed becomes the motivation for war because greed is going to drive us to go to war so we can capture these other black people and then sell them and make money off of it. So it's greed. So I don't have any problem with taking some of that money from those governments that succeeded those kingdoms who made those decisions. And you shouldn't either. We can still be brothers, but you got to pay us. Everybody got to pay. We talk about our African brothers. So we're going to get to this point. I want to get to something, but let's keep listening.
Which they also bought with slaves. The slave trade had become an arms race, altering societies and economies across the continent. As for the slaves themselves, they faced unimaginable brutality. After being marched to slave forts on the coast, shaved to prevent lice, and branded, they were loaded onto ships bound for the Americas. About 20% of them would never see land again. Most captains of the day were tight packers, cramming as many men as possible below deck. While the lack of sanitation caused many to die of disease, and others were thrown overboard for being sick or as discipline, the captains ensured their profits by cutting off slaves' ears as proof of purchase. Some captives took matters into their own hands. Many inland Africans had never seen whites before.
Let's skip ahead a little bit.
Most of the slaves taken were men.
I want y'all to hear this part. This is the part I want you to
of its able-bodied population. But because most of the slaves taken were men, the long-term demographic effect was even greater. When the slave trade was finally outlawed in the Americas and Europe, the African kingdoms whose economies it had come to dominate collapsed, leaving them open to conquest and colonization. And the increased competition and influx of European weapons fueled war.
Yeah. So most of the African, I think we understand that most of the people taken were men, okay? Now, there's a couple other videos I'd like to talk to you about, but I think this is the most important because this is some actual slaves, black Africans who were captured, and they were talking. So listen to what our brothers
interviewed the former slaves, including the two women you hear in this broadcast. Himself interviewed just before he died in 1979, Falk was going on about how he believed in giving blacks the right to go to school, giving them the right to vote, giving them the right to go into anything they qualified for.
And you guys hear,
and then he said,
hit the number one button.
He experienced an epiphany.
Yeah, sitting down on a wagon tongue with this old black man, and was telling him what a different kind of white man I was. I remember him looking at me. Kind of white man I was.
I want you guys to listen to this. All right, I want to make sure you guys can hear what our people have to say. Just in case you all are saying, oh no, slavery happened a long time ago. I want you to listen to what our black brothers and sisters who were actually slaves had to say. I want y'all to listen to that. This is important. and understanding what they went through here in the United States. So this is a story of a young college student, young white man who's going down there talking to Africans who were enslaved. I think this is around 1820 or something, 1920 or earlier than that. But listen to what they have to say. Basically, this white man says he goes up to this old black man who was a slave, and says, "I'm a different kind of white man. I'm not like the rest of those white men. I believe you have the right to vote and all these things, the right to live freely." And then what did the black man say? He said, "You can't give me something that I was born to have. This is a right I was born with. But you can take it away from me if you have all the policemen and the judges and the authority on your side." And that's what you've done. He said, you still have that same disease. You just don't recognize it. The fact that this white man thinks he can give this black man, this liberal-minded white man thinks he has the authority to give this white man what his life as a human being entitles him to anyway, shows that he himself is racist. That's what this black man who was a slave trying to explain. He said, I have a right to my humanity, but you're trying to take it. This is what our African brothers did to us. This is what our African American brothers and sisters did to us by owning us. They took away our humanity for almost 380 years. So, when the question comes up, well, you're not affected by slavery. Well, yeah, we have a legacy of being deprived of our humanity, which moves forward today, which lives in our society today, i.e. George Floyd. He had a right to be left alone, to live his life and enjoy it. But that right was taken from him. And he was treated yet less than human by Darren Chauvin, a representative of the state, a representative of the government, a so-called lawman. You see what I'm saying? So this is the context in which you need to understand now. That's what the slave owner had. Our slave. We'll listen to one or two of these statements.
Furious.
So today, I don't know how I'm living.
I remember that just as well look like to me, I can.
Been slaves all our lives. My mother was a slave, sister was a slave, father was a slave.
They know nothing about reading right. All that I know, they teach you to mind your master and your missus. Mom and them didn't know where to go. She asked the tree to go. Just like he told some mountain, didn't know where to go.
They are haunting voices from the past, not actors reading a script or scholars reading a text.
These are people, Look, these are our black brothers and sisters. This is another black slave owner right here.
Points out in this essay, since it's to sell liquor, they often lived side by side with slaves, on occasion marrying them, and their white neighbors tended to see them as a potentially.
All right, so that's another one. All of that is in there. That's something you guys can take a look at later on if you want to. But for the most part, I think I proved my point. I know I have not let anybody in over the past couple of days. I've not allowed anybody to enter into the conversation, but this has been a 3-day conversation, and it's been inspired, by this my trip here to Hispaniola, which is the site of Christopher Columbus, and also the site of the first slaves were brought from Spain to the New World. But I'm going to go ahead and open this up. You guys, if you want to talk about it, this is probably something you have to debrief about. I have my thoughts on it. I'm interested in what you guys have to say on this subject. Did you learn something new over the past 3 days? What's the most interesting thing? I mean, before we left, we went over the fact that white women were also slaves. But now we got, black women being the majority of the slave owners of other black people, black folks. No white men entered into the interior of Africa. They were all captured and caught by other black people. The link is in the chat room. A lot of you black Americans have something to let off your chest at this point with this new information. And remember, we're talking about it in the point of from a lawsuit, but I think that our ancestors would want us to get justice. I think that they would want us to get justice from whomever it was that caused them the injustice of losing their humanity, i.e. enslaving them. Anybody who wants to come in and have this conversation, come on in. The link is in the chat room. If you want to get the likes up, I would appreciate that. Please contribute to the Super Chat, the Cash App, and the PayPal. If you like these sort of conversations, some of you, you may want to talk about the latest hip hop star, or whether or not Quavo should have took his Bentley back from Sweetie, or Saudi, or whatever her name is. And I guess we could talk about that sort of stuff too, but I think this is important. I think, the question of reparations is important, and it's been thrown back and forth for decades. And see, now I understand why why the academics never went too deep with it. Why? Because when you begin to dig below the surface, there's some things you can't ignore, i.e. number one, our own African brothers played a heavy part into our capture. Sisters too. Our own African kings sent their people out to capture. They waged war for the purpose of capturing slaves, not war for traditional things wars were fought over. They manufactured war so they could have a reason to go out and capture other black people. Malika, how you doing today, brother?
Peace, brother. Happy belated birthday to you.
Well, it's not quite yet. This is my birthday's coming up this I believe Sunday. I tried not to keep track, but man. So this series, man, what have you picked up, man? Starting from a couple of days ago, what are your thoughts, man?
The amazing thing is the facts and just taking the emotion out of it, but just getting the facts and what you're breaking it down, like you see, taking it from a legal perspective, take your emotion out of it.
Right.
But just presenting the information and just absorbing it. And that's how the way I do it. I take the emotion out of it and just understand the facts of what's going on. Especially when you started from Africa, how the way the kings and the actual black men that were head of certain areas in certain parts of Africa, they just sold our ancestors for money. And you just saying it's for greed. Don't take it personal. Take your emotionalism. Stop romanticizing about your people and realizing, our people can be greedy too. They saw us as a profit and a means to end to make money. And you slowly
go ahead. Bro.
And you just slowly started to show how the way it spread here in America. And the slave trade became a big thing. And Dr. Claude Anderson said, we built this country, but at the same time, we made white slave owners rich. We were the biggest profit during the 17 and 1800s. Yeah. And when you're
go ahead.
And when you did, and you just basically, you said between the mid to late 1800s, 40% of free black people owned slaves. And you said 68% of those free people were black women.
Now that was in South Carolina, in Charleston, South Carolina. It said that 42% of, and this is what he's talking about, Malika's referring to my quote, that 42% of the free black people in Charleston, South Carolina owned other black people. Of that percentage, 64% of those free black people were women. So they were black women. So there's a lot to take in, but go ahead, brother. What do you think, Malika?
And it's just, it's just when you bring that, it's like, wow, a lot of people say, well, a lot of, they were trying to save their families. And it's like, hold on. No. This was profit. And then you start going on, you start seeing you going in and you're seeing more proof of how the way, people don't go into saying, how did your family get this wealth?
Right.
How did like, okay, if you went back and you realized, okay, the Sperling family had its money, you, like you said, you started looking, damn, there ain't nobody that's a shade darker than me.
The crazy thing is, man, so I'm adopted into a family. My mother's from Mississippi. My adopted family on my adopted family on my biological father is from the Caribbean. But my real father on my biological father's family is from the Caribbean. My adopted father's family is from North Carolina. Okay, his father, my adopted father's father, was a dark-skinned black man from North Louisiana, Mansfield, by the name of Sperling. Now, his wife, her last name was Qualls, very white-looking, light-skinned woman, right, from North Carolina, outside of Charlotte, about a couple hours outside of Charlotte. So I get there to that Qualls family reunion. They got this big spread. Everybody looked, I mean, man, they look like some of the lightest black people I've ever seen, especially the older ones. You see what I mean? Mm-hmm. And I'm like, man, how did they accumulate all this land? And I'm looking through the family photos, and I'm like, this is 2004, by the way, right? They still own this land. And I'm trying to understand myself, how did they accumulate all this land?
Exactly.
You see, and why ain't no black people in the family photo album? They readily will acknowledge their Native American heritage and their white heritage, which lets me know, oh, I get it. I get it. And it was hard for me to just accept the fact, but yeah, these people own slaves. Mm-hmm. You know? I mean, they were lighter than me, man. You know, and it's like, wow. You know,
but you know what I found out, this becomes one of the best kept secrets within our community and within our people, because we don't want to face the reality and face the truth that we did some heinous stuff to our own people.
We did some, yeah.
And I like what you said. You said, it doesn't matter. Justice has no color.
Mm-mm.
It just should be done. But then I think, you know, you have that phrase, liberal white guilt, but then we're going to have our own semi-liberal black guilt, because we're going to feel bad that, oh, I did this to my people, did this to my people in the past. But then, like how you said, okay, pay up now.
Yeah, I see why these black scholars, why after they start digging into reparations, they just drop the subject. I see why. Because if I was the defense and you came in and sued, I don't know, let's say you sued the European, some European company or something like that inherited the African, you know, this African trade company, the African gold company that bought slaves from the west coast of Africa. The first thing they're gonna say is, well, look, first of all we did was set up a post on the shore, and the Africans brought them to us. If they didn't have it to sell, we wouldn't have bought it. You see what I mean? We didn't know. They basically what happened was, and the first thing they're gonna say is that this was stolen. We didn't know this was stolen property. We thought that they accumulated these captives during war. That was the law of the land at the time, that you can take captives during war and enslave them. That's what we were buying. And so it's going to be you to prove what these people were manufacturing, these false wars, even under their own tribal rules. And so you're going to then have to put the fault on the people who took who basically what we have here, if you're talking about it in the criminal context, is the possession of stolen things, the sale and transaction of unlawful of stolen things. The stolen things being Africans who were waged war upon by other African tribes, manufactured wars just for the purpose of being able to sell them to these European traders. As they said, traders went into the hinterland. They wasn't running into the interior of Africa, capturing other Africans. Only Africans did that. So they were basically illegally stealing people, even under their own tribal laws, right? Under the law of the land at the time, and selling them to Europeans. So who was at fault? Everybody's at fault. Yeah, you received stolen products, so the Europeans at fault. But what about the people who stole the product? You gonna let me get this straight. So you're going to prosecute the person who bought the TV, but you're not going to prosecute the person who broke into the house, took the TV off the wall, and went out the window with it. Is that what you're saying, brother? You understand what I'm saying? Does that even make sense in the criminal context? So we have to, and I don't take it personal, but we have to. And then what about the people who bought the stolen TV from the person who bought the stolen TV from the first place, i.e. the plantation owners and the slave owners? We looking at black people involved in that equation too. When 171 people in your state own slaves, and 171 black people in your state own slaves, that's a number you can't overlook. You see what I mean? Many millionaires because of slavery. Many black people millionaires because of slavery.
And you know what I realized though too?
Oh, yeah.
You did that 170 some odd.
And that's in South Carolina alone. But go ahead.
So if we start spreading that around through all the rest of the antebellum South, and even coming up north, and we start seeing, well, how many people made their money off of slavery? You got a lot of black people that ain't trying to come up off of that.
You got a lot of black people who go visit the Hamptons.
Exactly.
A lot of black people who've had money and had businesses for a long time. They come from that old rich black money. It's a lot of them. Their families made that money off slavery. And look, especially up in that Maryland area, Baltimore, Maryland,
PG County, all them people,
all of that. So all of them got to pay. Everybody's got to pay. Doesn't matter your color. If you played a part in the slavery, then you need to be sued for your reparations, your part too. Everybody's got to pay their part. But what else you got to say, Malika? Then we're gonna go to John.
No, it's just I like it because I like the subject matter and the topic because you're making us think logically and take the emotion out and realizing, okay, here's the facts, and this is what we need, and this is what is owed to us. No matter who you are, you played your part in this. It's kind of, I like how the way you're taking it from a law perspective, and you're making anyone and everyone involved guilty and who's a part of it. And you also you're shedding light on certain things where other black people don't want to talk about because it's that dirty little lie. And you're like, no, this is something we need to know. And a lot of us black people didn't know about that, or know how intrinsically and how deep it is. And also we're finding out, like, you know, the dirty little things about our ancestors and our family.
But think about it. Out of 4 million slaves, this is what I want you to understand. If the numbers hold true, out of 4 million slaves, 4 million black people in 1860, if there were 4 million black, they said about 250,000 were free black people, right? Okay, about 250,000 of them were free black people. If the numbers hold true, that anywhere from 40 to 42% of those people own slaves, that's a large number, brother. Yeah, that's about 100,000 black families, 100,000 black people that own slaves, and black people that own other black people in the South and throughout the Americas. That's 100,000. Are we going to ignore that 100,000 in the wealth that they accumulated and the land that they had? Are we going to ignore those people?
And especially at the expense of your own people.
Yeah, I mean, it was greed. It was about greed. Slavery was not about color. It was about greed, because it was about color, they wouldn't have let those black people own slaves. It was about greed. It sounds to me, this is what it sounds to me like. They didn't care about your color in Africa. They sold your black butt over. They was black and they sold your black butt to these other folks, and they took you and showed you to some white folks, and those white folks sold you to whoever wanted to buy it. I think the color thing came up because they had to justify how, because it made them feel bad. You know what I'm saying? You can't be this good, upstanding Christian, Judeo-Christian person, and you around here raping and killing folks and cutting off the body parts and all that. You have to say that these are, they had to come up with some sort of note. And I'm sure some black people that felt the same goddamn way. Isn't that something?
Yeah.
But anyway, man, thank you so much. John Smith, man, unmute yourself. What are your thoughts on this whole subject? I think it's interesting. I've never heard it put like this before. Not in the context of how we would prepare for the loss. John?
Yeah, how you doing?
I'm
Can you
good.
hear me?
Yeah, you got some background noise in the back, man, but go ahead. What are your thoughts on this subject?
Oh, okay. Well, first of all, thank you for unpacking all of this. Unpacking all of this. I mean, over the past few days, it's very eye-opening. So, and it's very seldom that you see people of our heritage utilize their skill sets to bring forth and look and kind of bring everything to bear and turn this and make us examine our history. So thank you for doing that.
Yeah.
Yes, I mean, I'll keep it short. Definitely, this was an eye-opening experience for me. I understand it for me. It brought some realizations of how the African American bourgeoisie kind of stands, kind of lines themselves with the dominant society to because as you stated because they don't want the covers to come off this whole scheme that's been going that has transpired. This whole this basically this Holocaust that happened. But once again, brother, thank you very much, and keep pressing.
No problem. What do you think about some of these facts? Early on, we had Dr. Claude Anderson. He said 80% of the Africans who were brought over here were men, and it wasn't until 1808 when slavery was outlawed that they started bringing women over. What do you think about the fact that at least for the first 300 years of slavery alone, it was pretty much just black men here? What do you think about that?
Well, but when we look at, anytime there's and of course, and I'll go towards entertainment. Anytime there's an entertainment space, they always show the black female getting raped or, something, disparaging happened to her. But once again, that was only a small period of time. It's almost like when you talk about the Underground Railroad going north. That only happened for a short span of time if you do the research.
Let's put it in the context. They were here because they were brought in about an 80-20 ratio, basically is what they're saying. But for the most part, they were domestics and basically bedwenches.
Yeah.
Domestics and bedwenches. White women had them over here. So remember the other day we talked about how the white women were using the breastfeed and stuff. You can have a woman working in the field all day and then have her feed your little white baby, her milk would dry up.
Yeah. So
her job was to sit around and basically make babies, and she was the master's bedwench. So she lived in the roof of the basement. 80-20%, but the vast majority of blacks of the field slaves and the worker slaves were black men. That teaches me two things. First of all, there was never any intention to have a black population in the New World. And number two, when our lovely ladies, when black women try to play as though that they were the biggest victims in the slave trade, that's just not true because they didn't have those numbers. They would literally bring black men over here, work them to death, and replace them.
Yeah.
That was common in Brazil and the Caribbean. And there was also something that played out here in the United States. It wasn't until after 1808 that they began to bring black women over here in substantial numbers because they still had work to do. They still needed the slave population to do it, but they were no longer going to be able to import slaves from Africa. And so now you have a response when ladies say stuff like, oh, well, we did slavery and we were the biggest. No, you weren't. You weren't even here.
Exactly. Exactly. And that's a very true statement. Yeah. And that's the narrative, the negative and false information that was given out about that. Mm-hmm. Because I think you stated before in one of your previous some of your previous content that most females are going to seek comfort, and they had comfort. They didn't work in they didn't clear all the land. Mm-hmm. They weren't the ones out there doing the hard, intense, laborious work. Right. And for the most part, they really weren't doing all the mental work because we had very skilled African Americans, as shipbuilders, stonemasons, blacksmiths. So we had very skilled people, but for the most part, we did really. I'll be honest with you, 90% of the work.
put your red pill lens on. For all of you guys who call yourself members of the manosphere, put your red pill lens on. Knowing what you know about female nature, you think if presented with the option of working in the fields, and there's some other slave narrations on there. Man said the master wanted us to. There's this old thing, you work from when you could see when you couldn't. But that slave, that African slave, former slave, he said, no, you worked all night if you had to. You worked all night, all the way up into the night. You chopped cotton, you chopped tobacco, you did whatever you had to do, and you better not look like you're tired doing it.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? So yeah. What would you rather? Would you rather dedicate your loyalty to that man or to this white man who has you sitting in a nice cushy spot in the house, maybe in the basement, maybe in the attic? But the bottom line is you had a better spot. Your hypergamy, well, let me say it like this. I think hypergamy governs women, and opportunism and survival is what govern them. And so, although we like to romanticize it and say all these white men were bad and they was raping these black women, I think a lot of those black women saw it as an option compared to what they were looking at. I'm not saying there wasn't a power dynamic there that coerced them, but it was definitely a hypergamy involved in that.
And I definitely agree with you on that.
And they still doing it. But go ahead.
But you know how when that particular instance happens, when we have this, like I said, this negative information, this false information, and this false narrative going on about how women were treated, and it's crazy to me how this whole dynamic has been flipped on its head. Now they have pushed black women ahead of white men. I mean, ahead of black men in everything. So it's crazy. That's the thing that I'm still trying to wrap my brain around.
Man, the crazy thing is that we learned now that our sisters were active participants in our oppression.
Exactly.
Because I want you to think about it, man. If 42% of the slave owners who are black, and we're just using South Carolina, Charleston, South Carolina, if 42% of them were black and 64% of those people were women, black women, what does that tell you? It tell you they were, it was a thing to do.
Yeah. And
no woman wants another woman to outdo them. So, and here's the cold part about the vast majority of the slaves that they owned were black men.
Yeah.
You see what I'm saying?
Yeah. And that once again, that just, once you brought those facts out, and I was doing some cursory research of my own, that's mind blowing. But that's the narrative that they keep away from us to keep us in this same, pretty much the same thought stream.
Well, that's the convenient narrative, because otherwise it turns this whole thing of slavery on its head.
Exactly.
It shows you that you as black men are on your own. You have no friends. You damn sure can't trust your women, and you damn near can't trust each other.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? It shows you that you don't have your African brothers who you romanticize about so much have turned their backs on you long ago. That your sisters can be bought and paid for the highest price by your enemy, and they will then go along and help. And that your own black brothers will choose money over you. And if you want a modern day look at that, look at the dope game. Some of the same reasons that these black slave owners use to oppress you were the same reason the drug dealers use. Well, somebody gonna do it. If I don't do it, somebody gonna do it. Got to get my money.
Yep.
We know it's immoral and wrong and everything, but oh well, everybody else is doing it.
You're right about that, and that's where our morality goes out the window when it comes to a dollar sign. But one thing I would like to point out is that I see there's these two dynamics going at black males, especially black males that from the diaspora, and I'm not talking about the bourgeoisies or the ones that have, you know, or the intellectuals.
Yeah, everybody participated, but go ahead.
Yeah, but it's almost like, so first you have the bourgeoisie working against, you know, the black bourgeoisie working against the indentured or the workers, and you know, black bourgeoisie intellectuals, I'm sorry, and then you have black women working against this as well. So it seems like, you know, it's like with a recipe like that, it's no wonder why, you know, the institution of black families is where it is right now.
Right. And that's why, you know, this to me is just more, brother, you know, this started off with me trying to, it's hard to even talk about this. You know, I've only been able to do like one show a day because once I'm finished with this, I'm drained.
Yeah.
I mean, but you brothers don't owe loyalty to anybody. You don't owe it to Africa. You don't owe it to the United States. You don't owe it to the black population in the U.S. or anywhere else in general, especially black American men, because see, unlike our Jamaican brothers and our Trinidadian brothers, Haitian, Dominican, all these people who are Africans, we don't have a land. Slavery didn't end with us having a land that we could call our own. You see what I mean? At least the Jamaicans, they got a little small island, but at least it's theirs. The Haitians, they got a share island, but at least it's theirs. We didn't have that.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? When you say American, you don't think of black men. You think of some white guy who goes to some Christian church somewhere in Omaha.
Yeah.
We didn't get that. So you brothers have a right. You are free. And you have paid a debt. And you have suffered. You've been held responsible for things that you didn't even do. You were unlawfully kidnapped. You were unlawfully chained in the hulls of ships. You were unlawfully sold and bartered off and traded and bought by both black and whites, both men and women on both sides, and Indians, Native Americans also. You don't owe anybody anything. You have paid your debt. So if you gentlemen want to get your passports and move somewhere else and do whatever it is you want to do, that's fine. You don't owe anybody anything else. And see, the main reason that black men don't leave the United States is because of loyalty to our black women, because we've been taught that they was with us from day one. They was on the Mayflower, they was chained up 50-50 on them boats. Come to find out, that's a damn lie. Come to find out, the vast majority of the slave owners that were black were women themselves. So they've already reaped the benefit of what the white man set up as a system. Our own brothers reap the benefit. Anybody who now wants you to stay in the United States, when you come to the determination that it is not in your best interest, either mentally or emotionally or physically or whatever, that your life may end, that you're stressed out, then you have a right to leave now. And see, this is something that's been my ongoing. This has been my ongoing theme to black men as a YouTube content creator. You are free. That's all I'm telling you. I'm just preaching a message of free, and I'm giving you of freedom, and I'm giving you all the reasons why you are free. Some of you are beholden to the blood. We got to hold on. Come to find out, damn near half the people that you trying to hold on for and free from oppression was oppressing you in the form of their ancestors was the goddamn slave owners, even if they were black. You trying to hold on and stand and fight for your sister, and your sister's been laying down with the white man. And your sister's been inheriting other black slaves from the white man. You see, this is what I'm telling you. My thing to you brothers is, man, you are free. You're God's children. You paid your debt to everybody. If you want to stay, you can stay. If you want to leave, you can leave, but you shouldn't feel guilty about it. This is all I'm saying. And this has been my message to you brothers. You've done enough. You're free. You paid your debt. You don't owe anybody anything, and you don't have to justify. But if they want justification, give it to them. Well, why don't you go visit Africa? Because why don't you go visit Ghana? Because they had 64 slave ports along the coast, and the people in Ghana right now are descended from the people that kidnapped my ancestors and stuffed them on them boats, marched us to the shore and stuffed us on them boats and sold us for rum and pots and guns. That's why. You understand what I'm saying, John?
Yeah, most definitely, bro. You really are spitting hot flames right now. I mean, this is one of the most needed conversations I think that is needed in what we call the, let's start at a micro level, the conscious community, but at large, the Black community.
Yeah.
We need to have the conversation.
The conscious community, they won't hit this.
Oh no, you're right. You're right. Because they
would offend too many of of Black women.
Yeah, you're right.
They would offend, and they would run all the primary supporters of the conscious community are Black women, Black American women, because they benefit from the Black power system. And let me tell you, the academics, they won't hit this. They damn sure ain't gonna talk about this in their little black history classes. They're gonna gloss over it a little bit. They'll be disingenuous. They can't touch it. They'll get booted out of the school. They won't get their tenure. And most of academia is run by women anyway. Most of the Black academians are women. And on top of that, they're feminists. So they're not gonna hit this.
Yeah, you're right.
So the conscious community is not gonna touch it. The bourgeois damn sure ain't gonna hit it. The historians aren't gonna hit it. So all you got is a bunch of red pill dudes on the internet. Me looking at it from a legal standpoint. I didn't know what I was gonna dig. I had a hunch, but in doing the research for this, I didn't know all that I was gonna dig up in this. But having to look at it as a litigator, okay. My first question is, well, the first thing I got to do is figure out who's the victim and who's the perpetrator, who the plaintiffs and who the defendant. Okay, well, the descendants of slaves, the American descendants of slaves, the FBA, another group of people did that. I could feel, okay, these are the foundational Black Americans who can trace their heritage back to the plantations of what was the United States and the territories that preceded the United States. Got it. Pretty simple and to the point. We can do the numbers later. ADOS, FDA, those are your plaintiffs. Now, who are the defendants? Who are the defendants? Well, everybody, we got to talk about, we know white people in the European countries are sanctioning it. Yeah, okay. But realistically, they were the middlemen. Those are the ones that ran the boats. Okay, but who did they buy the merchandise from? They bought it from these African kings along, in Africa, whether it's Ghana, Nigeria, Togo, Benin, Senegal, the Gambia, all these other places, Angola. Well, those are the ones that stole the property. So we definitely got to bring them in. Then we bring the buyers in, and then we bring the buyers who then resold the property, and you got to bring in the plantation owners. Okay, where were they from and what do they look like? So the more you did, you like, damn, this messes up my narrative.
Yeah, so the thing about it is what you're doing is, basically discovering the chain of custody.
That's exactly what I'm doing, discovering the chain of custody. And everybody who touched us in the chain of custody is responsible. You see, and here's the crazy thing you got to understand. Would we have ever even had a slave problem if those Africans had refused to go into the hinterland and kidnap other Africans?
Yeah. Yeah, I
don't see a bunch
I don't see it
running up into the interior of Ghana, trying to kidnap Blacks. Because here's the thing, the lifespan of a white man on the west coast of Africa was less than 1 year.
Yeah. Oh wow.
They couldn't even survive. That's why when you read books like Daughters of the Trade, it becomes so important. It becomes important because it lets you know that those women and those families, those African families on the coast, helped those white men. They cooked for them, they kept them safe, they allowed them to use their contacts. They provided a shelter for them to exist. You know what I mean? Those white men would not have been able to set up shop had it not been for those African families on the west coast of Africa, allowing them to stay there. The life expectancy of a white man on the west coast of Africa at that time was 1 year. They wouldn't have made it, but yet and still they were able to survive for 380 years.
Wow. And that's crazy. That's when you think about that in terms of that, and you kind of transpose that, level of thinking to today. It's funny how they can operate in our communities and we turn a blind eye, but you go in their communities, especially up until like the 1960s, you could be dead. or messing around in their community.
Well, no, that's not true either, brother. Didn't you hear what the man Ellison, what was his name? He had a seat in the white folks' church. What does that tell you?
Yeah.
What does it tell you? 171 plantation owners in South Carolina were black. What does it tell you that one of the major contributors to the Confederate Army was a black plantation owner?
Well, that's
you've been lied to, even about this whole separation and segregation thing.
Well, the thing about it is, it's almost like these guys were like he was probably like had the status of an athlete or entertainer at that time.
But he had it was more than that, brother. He employed white people.
Shoot.
He
was big dollars.
He was in bid. They were all in cahoots together, but that's what I'm trying to tell you. See, you've been lied to. You've been lied to. You've been pretty much everything you've been taught about slavery has been a lie. Okay, it was the greedy against the victims. That's basically what it was. That's what slavery was. The greedy versus the victims. The victims of the slave trade being those who were in bondage and didn't have enough money to buy themselves freedom. And then, ironically, the same people who were slaves oftentimes turned around and became slave owners. Isn't that something? Think about that. Yeah. Many of those who were slaves, once they bought their freedom and became slave owners themselves, and treated their black slaves the same way that the white slave owners had treated them.
Wow,
this is what I'm trying. So
that's crazy. That is crazy.
Yeah, think about that, man. Think about the fact that we often brag on how well black folks did after slavery ended. But I always wondered this. This is something I always wondered. How in the hell? And if you look at the Congress after 1865, you had many black folks as representatives and senators and whatnot in the U.S. Congress, and then also in some of the state houses. If slaves couldn't read, how did you have so many people elected to Congress in 1866, 67, 68 during Reconstruction?
Yeah.
If they couldn't read. No, this was the elite slave-owning class of black people who then said, well, hell, we black, we're going to use this opportunity too.
Yeah.
Yeah, we were victims too. You understand what I'm saying, brother? You see what I mean?
Yeah, and once again, you're uncovering and revealing some facts that the vast majority of our community does not know or care to, or they're being willfully ignorant towards it. Like for me, I never really kind of put it in those contexts. I knew there was probably some collaboration going on, but I didn't know to what level.
Now, the reason I'm looking at it like that is because I'm like, well, where can I find these? How do I quickly find the people who, who were responsible? What's a quick way to do it? Well, okay, I know that, wealth is quiet, but it speaks a certain sign language.
Yeah.
And oftentimes when people become wealthy, what else do they want? They want to accumulate power. And so what's the quickest way to step into power? You get into politics.
Yeah.
So now I'm like, okay, well, damn, and I've always wondered, how do you get people like PBS Pinchback to be a governor of Louisiana during Reconstruction? I mean, this man couldn't even read. A lot of African slaves couldn't even read. They was walking around barefoot. How did he get that sort of stability to learn how to read in 1 year, 2 years, or whatever, get this sort of education and get the confidence of the people? Many of these people were slave owners.
Yeah.
Many of these people have been educated. This is what we're looking at. You heard all those people in Louisiana that were slave owners.
Yeah.
It's something, man. So it's a trip.
Yeah. Yes, it is. And and as you stated, when Reconstruction happened, a lot of our people, didn't know how to read or write, and all of a sudden we had this ascension of a certain black class, but of course over time they folded themselves into the struggle class, which they weren't.
The thing is, Charles Irby said the Boule have never cared about black people. These weren't Boule; they were just the ruling class. Boule means advisor to the king. These were the kings, brother.
Yeah.
That's what I'm trying to explain to you. They were the kings.
Yeah.
Many of them had more money, wealth, and influence than the white folks.
Yeah.
Okay, because most of the white folks were poor and broke.
Yeah.
The vast majority of these white people that got here today didn't come till after 1905, 10, whatever, the damn famines in Ireland and Italians leaving and coming. They didn't get here till late.
Yeah.
And so this is what I'm trying to tell y'all, man. You've been lied to, and it's not me. I'm looking at it from the experts, from these people who you've seen on YouTube. It's right there. This is not all I did was all I did was type in black slave owners and all that came up.
Yeah.
You see what I mean? With the stats and everything.
Well, once again, that's a history that we, mostly as African Americans, don't want to examine. Let's be honest. It's a thorn. It's one of those ugly secrets that we kind of pack away in the back of a closet.
Is it really a secret?
Well, let me rephrase that. A hidden truth.
Hidden.
It's hidden to a point because the vast majority of people have forgotten about it.
You got streets and names of black plantation owners.
Well, yeah, this is true, but I think we have disassociated. We've come to the space where we've disassociated race and the event.
Yeah,
we've dissociated.
Yeah, and see, let me tell you something again. There's a reason why I don't do. I don't necessarily trust the academics. I definitely don't trust the black power types, because let me tell you why. They have to make an enemy for you. And they tell you the enemy is this white man who kept you in slavery and ran up into the interior of Africa and waged war, kidnapped all these black people and put you on boats and then brought you over here. They have to keep that as your enemy.
Yeah.
You see what I'm saying? What does that do? Because remember, they're the ones showing you this is your enemy. And I'm going to help. I'm going to teach you about your enemy and how to fight your enemy. They play on your fear. You see, that's what the modern day black power folks do. That's what they stole it. They stole your heritage. And come to find out, we sold our heritage to them for a price. We sold our people to them for a price. That's what I find out. I found out that our enemy is not just those white folks who benefited from slavery. It's also those black folks who benefited from slavery and willfully did it. And what do we try to do when confronted with the fact that our own people committed these atrocities against us and oftentimes initiated the beginning of the atrocities by kidnapping us unjustly in made up wars, the purpose of which to go and get captives. We romanticize that.
Yeah.
What's to say when we go back over to Africa, another 300-400 years go by, they don't kidnap us and sell us off again.
Yeah.
You understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, you're right. And
I'm not saying they would. I'm just saying this is the loyalty that we have to each other.
Yeah, and you're right. The loyalty is there especially when you talk about money or greed.
Yeah.
Listen, greed. The morality is off the table, and you said it. We always talk about how capitalism hurts our country or hurts society at its crust. I mean, it hurts the most vulnerable because it's easy to attack the broken and the poor.
All capitalism is an extension of our own inner personalities.
Yep. You're right.
We want it. We want the best. We want more. We want more than what we need. This is all that capitalism is. That's it. That's all capitalism is. Capitalism is, I want this for myself. My team is better than your team. My tribe is better than your tribe. See, the problem is history has been mistaught. You don't have any friends as a black man. Yeah. You damn near can't even trust yourself.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? You can't even trust you got slaves that became slave owners and were as brutal as the white slave owners. You got black men and black women who had black, and it wasn't just your damn family members. This is what we're dealing with, man. So, I say all that to say, man, brothers, you're free. You don't owe anybody anything. Nobody owed you anything. Our ancestors, those slave folks, those voices you heard, they robbed us of our humanity, and And so it's incumbent upon you to go somewhere where you don't have to fight for your humanity. You basically are allowed to have what you were born to have, i.e. your humanity. In the United States, you're still not necessarily free mentally. You can't even go down the street without all the racism and stuff messing with your head. You got to watch black men getting shot in Milwaukee, and for having air fresheners hanging on their windshield. And you gotta watch a black man die after having some white cop kneel on his neck for 9.5 minutes. This is what you got to deal with in the United States. So you might have your little job and your 401k and your $42,500 a year, but you're still not free, and nobody's gonna tell you. Your black power advocates, they just gonna point to the white man and say it's all his fault. The historians are gonna gloss over the part that blames women, because they feminists and not goddamn selves. And so unless you go out there and do the research on your own, or me, I'm just looking at it from a monetary point of who do we sue? And it's only because of that you're able to, many of you are learning about this. Because had I not said, well, who would I sue if you always talk about reparations? I'm tired of hearing the conversation. What we gonna do about it? Okay, who do we sue? If it wasn't for me doing this, which is largely an academic exercise, would we really even know about it? Would this be something that's on our minds? But anyway, brother, you guys are free. Don't owe anybody anything. That's been the whole point of this message. I appreciate you guys. Thank you, John Smith.
No problem, brother.
I appreciate all the donations. This has been probably the last one I'm gonna do this extensively. We'll talk about this in the future, but I look forward to the comments. I look forward to what people have to say. I have my own take on it. I would like to hear what you all have to say. But at the end of the day, all I did was show you videos and give you commentary. And so if you get mad at those historians and people who decided to put this information in the place where I can put the links. All the links are in the description. Review them, talk to them, see what you think about it. I gave you some links to some documents. I've actually ordered all the books referenced, so I'm looking forward to that reading about black slave owners. But other than that, brothers, you don't owe anybody anything, man. Go where God wants you to go. I love you guys. I appreciate you. I hope you guys appreciate the time and energy I put into this. If you appreciate what I'm doing, contribute to the Super Chat, the Cash App, and the PayPal. Let me see. We got one more. Soldier Boy says, can I call in? I agree with what you're saying, but just want to get to a bottom line of offsetting all these being brought forward. My point is just to solve the problem and see problem. Well, okay. The whole point, Soldier, was we talking about reparations, and clearly we're not going to get a political response, right? So we're going to have to take matters in our own hands. So maybe what I'll do is, based on this, I'll get a group of lawyers together, and I'll ask them to review these videos, and I'll see what would be the next step we would take now that we know what we know. I kind of think that we would probably go with, and I'm answering Soldier Boy's question. I was about to get off, but and I don't want to go too much longer because I don't want to go into 3 hours. But if you guys want me to keep talking about this, go ahead and hit the like button, hit the contribution button, and I'll keep talking about it. But putting this together, now that I have a rudimentary understanding of the facts, who the parties are, I would say you could literally go county to county. Those of you who could trace your heritage back to, let's say, South Carolina. Let's say we'll use that gentleman, that owner of that plantation in South Carolina. What was his name? Williams? What was his name, man? I forgot his name. John, what was his name? Do you remember the man's name?
No, not off the top of my head, brother.
Well, it's at the beginning of the video. Let's say you were a member of that black man's plantation. William Ellison was his name. William Ellison Jr.
There you go. Yeah.
Ellison Jr. Born April. You trace your family's heritage back to him. You allege unjust enrichment. You then file a lawsuit, and in county court, district court, and you begin. And you pull whatever records you can pull. If there are other parties, you figure out where you came from. If there are any records, the census is going to have a lot of information. Now, of course, you're going to have a lot of procedural hurdles, like it's going to pass the statute of limitations, all that different stuff. But you file anyway, you know, and then you take that matter up to the Supreme Court of that state and see what law you can create. But, you know, that's the simplest way. There's also class actions. You can file against certain corporations that were inherited by other corporations, you know, white corporations. And then you can also begin to sue countries like Ghana and these other places, and you can trace. I will use DNA evidence. It would be a conglomerate of things. It's complicated, but technology is allowing for us to get down to the minutia of where we came from. And so, you know, estimates can be made, but if we really want to do something, we can. You can pretty much create a lawsuit to do anything you want it to do within certain aspects. So it's not that big of a deal. It's just a matter of doing research and moving forward. Would you go to world court? Hell no. I'll go right down to that federal court down there in Manhattan, or that other one over there in Brooklyn. Or if it's somewhere in South Carolina, go there. That's what I would do. I wouldn't, why do I go to world court? I want a judgment here in the USA. Sean, how you doing? How can I help you?
Hey, how you doing?
I'm good. What do you want to add to this conversation? You guys want me to keep talking, contribute to the Super Chat, the Cash App, and the PayPal. I'll talk a little longer. What's your question, brother? What's your statement? What do you want to add to this? Sean, unmute yourself. Sean, there you go. Go ahead. Oh, well. Sean, you got to unmute yourself. All right, you there. Go.
Yeah, the narrative makes sense that, you know, blacks would own each other as slaves and create a lot of self-hatred because we continue to keep blaming just Caucasian people and other groups of people. But just looking at just the data and the fact speaks for itself that, you know, if we were owning each other and probably the cruelest.
I don't think it was hate. I think it was greed.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, you know, we throw that term self-hate around. Self-hate and narcissism seems to be, you know, I don't even know what that means anymore because there's a clinical definition of self-hate means you just gonna go ahead and shoot yourself. To me, if you hate yourself, shoot yourself.
True.
This is just greed. Listen, we don't even need to romanticize it. It's just flat out greed. They did it for the money. You see what I mean?
So how do you think the results will come to be if we say that, you know, a lawsuit went in against different companies or?
Yeah, I don't care what they think. I just want my money back. I want my money. Period. I'm not emotional about it. We can still be friends, and I can sue you. True. You see what I'm saying? We can still be brothers, and I'm suing you, my African brother, for the money that you owe us. Period. There's nothing emotional about it. You owe a debt, and we want our money. You owe it to us. If you don't give it to us, we're going to file a suit and start seizing your property. You see what I mean?
Yeah, that's going to be a hard. It's not impossible.
Hard?
It's not impossible, but
tell me why it's going to be hard.
Why would it be hard? Because we see now, just in terms of corporately, you know,
how much. Why would it be hard to draft a lawsuit in federal court? Let's say you suing the country of Ghana or its representative, and file it for $402 and serve them via the habeas. Via the Hague Treaty.
I don't think it would be difficult to draw up the document.
So what's the hard part?
The hard part is that I don't think a lot of us, meaning African Americans, would feel that narrative or what they did need to be exposed.
And that's why I was telling you earlier. That's why reparations, oftentimes the conversation just fizzles out. You understand now?
I understand exactly.
Have you been following my page long, brother?
I have. Yeah, I have.
What do I say about black men? What's one of the things I tell you guys about yourselves?
Well, I only thing I've heard you say time and time again, you know, that, you know, we can do anything that we put our mind to.
Yeah. And I do say that you're beautiful, wonderful human being.
Right. You know, all of those subjects.
What else do I say about you?
I'm not sure what you're trying to.
Too goddamn nice.
True, you do say that a lot, And you did.
I promise you, if it was a bunch of white, but if it was 20 million white boys in this country that can point to a system or a country that helped enslave them, Ireland, a white country, wherever, England, they would sue and they wouldn't have a problem about getting their money. But see, you guys are so concerned about offending your African brother. We don't want the narrative. Just get your money. You want reparations, right, Sean?
Absolutely.
You think we deserve reparations, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay. Well, in order to make us whole again, we got to sue everybody involved. That includes those successors of those African kings and queens in Ghana, Nigeria, Togo, Benin, Senegal, all those places. That means we also got to sue those shipping companies, those white-owned shipping companies out of Europe, and also those European crowns. And we also have to sue the plantation owners here in the United States. And if you're in the West Indies or wherever you at, then those people too. But the bottom line, everybody has to pay. And we don't need to be emotional about it.
But you bring up a great point, in terms of pay, because everybody benefits.
They all benefit
from our suffering, including recently, which is another subject, the Black Lives Matter.
Well, let's not get off subject, brother.
We're not gonna get off subject, but I think
that's a whole other conversation.
But the benefit, falls on Black people who are in power now. That if we keep with the narrative that is just.
Well, the Black people who are in power now want to maintain the status quo. That's what they want you to do. Is start filing suits against African countries and people who might be related to them.
Absolutely.
And benefited, who were slave owners themselves, black slave owners themselves. They don't want you to touch that. And your Black power people, they don't want you to touch this either.
Absolutely.
Everybody talk about, Black. Okay, so that means one of your people comes from a family of people who own slaves. Should that person then be able to be involved in a reparations lawsuit? Because they were now a culprit. Think about it. Think about that.
I think it would get kind of
it's gonna get nasty.
It's gonna get really nasty, because if you
it's gonna get nasty. It's real nasty. Yeah. Because you're gonna literally have brothers suing brother, cousins suing cousins. But oh well. It is what it is. This is how justice don't have. It was an ugly position, But if you want reparations, everybody has to pay.
True. We too nice.
And you don't need to be nice about it, but there's no need to be emotional about it either. I'm not emotional about it. Like I say, you can sue your own goddamn family members. There's nothing to be emotional about. You owe a debt, pay it. Don't pay it, you get sued. How hard it is to file a lawsuit? Not hard at all. You understand what I'm saying?
Yeah. In looking at different lawsuits,
you brothers just got to grow some backbone.
You're too
nice and you want to get along. You're more concerned about being liked than you are about being respected. That's the main problem with Black men. You want to get along. You don't want to make enemies. You already got enemies. They already don't like you. Your own brothers don't like you. At least make them respect you. You got to stop caring so much about what people think. And you worried about being the bad guy. Embrace being the bad guy. Be that guy. Yeah, we sued all y'all. And then we bought some first class tickets to Accra. That's how that was our coming home party. You see what I'm saying?
I'm following.
We broke your country with $1 trillion judgment. We're gonna seize each and everything piece of property that you have in this country. And it might not be one big lawsuit. I don't think it'd be literally hundreds, thousands maybe, But it could also be a class action suit. But the bottom line is, if you want reparations, stop talking about it and be about it. And recognize people who are just talking to you. You see a lot of these historians, they don't want to hit that. It's too many hot buttons in there. And a lot of these Black Power, the whole Black Power movement now, this pro-Black movement now is really a pro-simp, pro-Black woman empowerment movement. I don't care about that. I just want the money. If you want, I'm a problem solver. And the way I solve problems is through lawsuits. and negotiation. Let's get the lawsuits filed. Let's get the evidence. Let's make sure we have a couple $1 million behind us, and let's pick a target. And I've told you guys before, some of the softest targets are going to be these African countries because they have no defense. Who do you think is going to stand a better chance? A Black American plaintiff in front of an American judge somewhere in South Carolina suing an African country for his family being wrongfully taken from Africa? Or do you think that judge is going to give that African country a break? Or do you think they're more, or are you trying to sue a white corporation in an American court? They don't care about what you do to that. Okay, so you sue the black company. Same thing with that whole Osama bin Laden, them suing Saudi Arabia and whatnot. After 9/11, the judge allowed them to sue that country. You understand what I'm saying, Sean?
I'm following.
Yeah, so it's not hard. When you say, I hate that, brother, I hate that, man. I mean, some of the comments on my page, you will never get any money for reparations. It's too hard. I hate that, man. That's disgusting to me.
We already given up.
It's like man to man when we talking about let's do this. There's always somebody in the crowd who say it's too hard. We can't do it. I hate that, brother. I literally hate that. You already defeated before you get out on the mat. You already defeated before you hit the field. I hate that attitude, and that's why a lot of black men, you're just gonna be destined to be losers, man, because you defeat yourself. I mean, you are descended from the first man on this planet who has traversed this planet, who built monuments to themselves, invented mathematics, religion, science, everything. And you are telling me you can't file a lawsuit? It's too hard? It's on something that everybody knows happened? This is not even something we really even have to recreate. You got people who studied years and years and worked on PhDs. You got the experts, you got the forum, you got the plaintiffs, you got the defendants. You put enough money behind it, somebody will go give you all the research you need. That's what experts are for. You can't say that, Sean. And I'm assuming you're a black man. You can't think like that. You got to cut that out. See, this world belongs to whoever is strong enough to take it and hold on to it. And so if you're going to have that attitude, you're just going to die out, brother. We got to eliminate that weakness in us, brother. I mean, I'm telling you from a place of love, but we can't come into the page that we can't do it. It's going to be too hard. Imagine how that sounds to me. And I've just sat here for the past 3 days and did 16 hours worth of research and been talking to y'all for literally 8 hours on how we can do it. And you say it's too hard to do. You see how disappointed I am in you, Sean? Or that, not just you, brother. I'm not picking on you, but I'm disappointed in that mentality that we have. You understand what I'm saying, brother?
I understand.
And so don't think like that. Just don't think like that. Don't even come out the box like that. Okay?
Okay.
God bless you, brother. I love you.
All right, take care.
Thank you for calling in. I appreciate all you guys, and I don't want to be too harsh because I'm coming from a place of love, but you got to change your attitudes, brothers. You got to, because that same attitude is what's getting us eliminated. You're too goddamn nice and too easy to make quit. You got everything you need. You have everything you need to be successful in this world. But your own minds, you've already, because of the low self-esteem that we have, because of the messages society has sent to you about what you can and can't do, and your station and your role and your social status in life, you don't believe you can. And I'm telling you that God is a God of justice, and God wants black men to have justice, just like he would want any oppressed people to have justice, any people who are unjustly done, and whoever it is needs to pay. And y'all need to recognize that, and recognize that, I don't have a problem with a person because they were a slave owner. I have a problem with a person because they were unjustly enslaving my people. And there's a debt that needs to be paid. I don't care what color they were. You need to pay me because I wasn't a slave. I have some ancestors who were slaves, but I wasn't one. Maybe if my ancestors were sitting next to me, they would have a different opinion. All I'm saying is there's a debt that needs to be paid. And I'm looking at it purely from a position of a lawsuit. That's it. There's no emotion involved in it. But, you know, if I got people who say, well, we can't do it and it's too hard in my corner, like, damn, I don't want to hear that from coming from my back when I'm trying to fight forward. That's what I'm trying to tell y'all. So change your attitudes, brothers, especially you black men, because you were the ones that did slavery damn near by yourselves. And so if you don't want reparations, stop goddamn talking about it. I don't want to hear nothing about it then. If you're not man enough to step up and say, well, we're going to get this and this is how we're going to do it, here's the plan, you know the academics aren't going to help you because they're conflicted out. The damn black power people don't want to touch it because if they do, they're going to offend the people, you know, a lot of the ladies who are slave owners, black women themselves. So they don't want to touch it. And it eliminates them being able to be the victim. This literally has a potential of overturning society and what we see as norm and abnormal. And you know, it upsets too many people, so they don't want to touch it. But if you brothers don't want to hit it, either way, I appreciate you guys, and thank you for all the contributions. You know, I think it's been a great conversation. I've enjoyed it. It's been painful, but I've enjoyed it. But either way, God bless you, and I'm out.